Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Cunningham, and my co-organizers Isis Dwyer and Delon Justinville and I are thrilled to present our symposium, Beyond Bones, Bodies, and Behavior, Shifting the Disciplinary Landscape Toward Biocultural Bodies. We'd like to begin with a quote from this symposium's namesake, George Stocking Jr., from his 1988 volume, Bones, Bodies, and Behavior, Essays on Biological Anthropology. Quote, there is a historical basis for an embracive and holistic conception of anthropology, in which the interface between biology and culture, rather than a disputed boundary, is a primary arena of inquiry. This symposium seeks to present new directions and dimensions of studying the biological body as scholars across all subfields engage in types of embodied research. Each paper will take up a theoretical, methodological, or practical approach to connecting bioanthropological perspectives, both present and past, to critical interventions across allied fields and cognate disciplines. Through a diverse panel of scholars, this symposium hopes to speak to these processes of shaping and reshaping our relationship to the body. And just to switch things up, our wonderful discussants will be interspersed among our paper presentations, each offering their comments on the presentations that they follow and on the theme of the symposium as a whole. If presentations conclude earlier than 15 minutes, we'll open up the mic for Q&A, but otherwise we'll ask that you hold all questions for our presenters until the end. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our first presenter, Lorena Madrigal, who is presenting There Was Symptoms Since He Was Little, looking for symptoms of renal medullary carcinoma before the cancer is diagnosed. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the organizers, to the organizers of the symposium. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so honored to be part of this wonderful group. It is hard to state the obvious, but let me try. According to the CDC, sickle cell trait is basically benign. It's in this statement, the CDC says the sickle cell disease, the sickle cell trait people usually have none of the symptoms of sickle cell trait, of sickle cell disease. And most of us learned and continue to teach that sickle cell trait is benign in non-malarial settings. After all, that's what all the textbooks say. In 2012, there was a summit to assess the effect on sickle cell trait in soldiers and in athletes. This is the citation. The authors were concerned about the high mortality rate in these two groups, and they conclude that even though they did have high mortality, sickle cell trait people had high mortality, the sickle cell trait might be a surrogate for yet another contributing factor for their unexplained deaths, and they left it at that. In these papers, WA is war fighters and athletes. This same group in 2021 had another summit. This is the citation. And they called this summit because they were concerned about the fact that in 2019 there had been a large number of deaths. And the type of death is called ECAST. ECAST means exercise collapse associated with sickle cell trait. This is a known entity in the clinical literature. But they were concerned about how many of them occurred in 2021. So they had this summit. They concluded, not even acknowledging the fact that these deaths in sickle cell trait people existed, had occurred? No. They said, we hope that in the next summit, we will have some conclusion and will know better. But basically, they overlooked it. And they gave the same recommendations on how to prevent the death once the event started. I am currently collecting data from sickle cell trait individuals. And here are some of their comments. I now believe my performance in sports was affected by my sickle cell trait, which wasn't known to me. I've had chronic anemia throughout my life without knowing why. Doctors always say sickle cell trait is benign, and the pain is in my head. And this goes for both men and women. I heard that so much growing up, I don't even address the pain anymore, and I just take painkillers. My pain has never been taken seriously because when I mention sickle cell trait, they think I just want pain medication, or they say sickle cell trait is symptom free. No one believes sickle cell trait can have symptoms, even though I am walking and talking proof. I currently have renal medullary carcinoma, which I have because I have sickle cell trait. I am currently fighting cancer at a certain cancer facility. And I have decided that the situation concerning the medical practice and sickle cell trait is so bad that the only way in which the medical community and the NIH is going to take sickle cell trait seriously is by focusing on renal medullary carcinoma, because nobody can deny that a cancer is deadly, but this one in particular. Let me tell you about renal medullary carcinoma. It is uniformly characterized by a complete loss of one gene and is extremely aggressive. It is found in sickle cell trait people. The median age at diagnosis is 22 years of age. It is rare. Currently, there is a study with 13 patients whose ages range between 5 and 41. It is sometimes found in sickle cell disease patients as well. There are more papers trying to find out what is the reason why it is found in sickle cell trait than trying to find early diagnostics. And I find that extremely offensive. Most papers say that it is preferentially expressed in people of African origin. But there are no studies available on renal medullary carcinoma among the populations with high frequencies of sickle cell trait in the Arabian Peninsula, in Southeast Asia. So how do they know? I don't know. Also, more males are affected. So, because people learn in medical school that sickle cell trait is benign, pediatricians don't know about it. Most doctors continue to practice and tell parents that sickle cell trait is benign. Therefore, there are no diagnostics for this aggressive cancer. Doctors are not watching for it, and when it is discovered, it is too late. Usually, the cancer is diagnosed when the child or young adult begins to urinate blood. By that point, the cancer has already metastasized, and the patient usually has less than a year to live. In the case of the father who gave me the idea for the title of my talk, the kid The kid had abnormal creatinine and other renal measures for several years. And the pediatrician said, that's weird. If the doctor had been trained to know that sickle cell trait is associated with a renal cancer, this should have been like an alarm bell. Eventually, the kid started having chest pain and coughing, and the pediatrician prescribed x-rays. He had cancer in his lungs. He had cancer all over his body. Then an oncologist asked the parent if the kid was sickle cell trait. And the son died in less than a year, and he was 16 years old. This was the first time that the pediatrician had heard about it. Yes, renal medullary carcinoma is rare, but it is probably not as rare as the CDC says. Regardless, the fact that it has a mortality rate of nearly 100% and that it occurs in children and young adults should make it a priority for research. It should also make medical schools start teaching about sickle cell trait as a non-benign condition. This is a study that has data on sickle cell trait and non-sickle cell trait people. We found that the odds ratio for kidney problems was 3.05 for sickle cell trait individuals with a highly significant odds ratio. So here's where I get to the biocultural body. The bodies of the children who have died of renal medullary carcinoma, the bodies of the children who have died of sickle cell exercise-related events, the bodies of the sickle cell trait men who have died under violent hands and who have said more than once, I can't breathe. All of them are suffering from unequal treatment under medicine, from lack of research about their condition, from inequality in the clinical setting, and from inequality by the police force. I have talked to trainers and coaches who think that if they accept that sickle cell trait is not benign, this will lead to discrimination. However, when clinicians say to people who have symptoms that the symptoms are not related to the genetic condition that people carry, the clinicians are dehumanizing and discriminating the people with the condition. The reality is that people with sickle cell trait in non-malarial areas do have higher mortality than people who only carry hemoglobin A. This is the reason those two summits have occurred. Many of them also have pain and several of the symptoms of sickle cell disease. Most of them in the USA also happen to be the descendants of enslaved people. This is a confluence of historical and clinical events which makes treating the condition difficult. Let us never forget that health is political. And this is where I finish. Thank you. We have time for questions? No questions?
Awesome. So we will now welcome our next presenter, Raquel Fleskis, who will be presenting Embodied DNA towards a theoretical conceptualization of community engagement in ancient DNA research.
Hello, everybody. My name is Raquel Fleskis, and I am deeply honored to take part in this important symposium at the AABAs this year. I come to this talk as somebody who conducts ancient DNA research in the historic period of the United States, a time period which is layered with histories of colonialism and extraction. As a white queer researcher whose work intersects with the histories of colonialism and African diasporic spaces, I work to leverage my privileges, knowledge, and resource to help meet the goals and questions of descendant communities, and furthermore, to create space for anti-colonialist approaches to science. So as a quick note before we get started, you may notice that I will be showing definitions of key theoretical concepts on the corners of my slides. I do this because theory was always very difficult for me when I was in graduate school. So for everybody learning in this room today, I want us all to meet on an equal playing field. And for me, that means it is important to translate concepts into a shared language. So with that, let's get started. Today, there exists many published guidelines on the best practices for engaging descendant communities and other relevant stakeholder groups in ancient DNA research. These guidelines and best practices have been shaped by the epistemologies and priorities of authors of these guidelines themselves. This includes guidelines written for museum institutions, geneticists, and those who are speaking on the rights of descendant communities, especially those of cultural communities who that have been/are marginalized. In addition, these guidelines speak for archaeological individuals living at distinctly different timescales, from those only hundreds of years old who have clear ties with living communities to those who are much deeper in time. This can lead to confusion or competing ideas regarding the best sets of practices for the field. And perhaps this can never be universally agreed upon, given that there are many factors at play when conceptualizing an ethical framework in ancient DNA. Every ancient DNA project has a different set of considerations, things like the histories of the archaeological individuals themselves, the histories of connected communities, the curatorial responsibilities of institutional stakeholders, researcher positionality, the socio-political context that the work takes place in, amongst other factors that might be too project-specific and numerous to list here. In this approach, a guidelines-based method may not adequately address the diverse contexts and perspectives inherent in these various projects. These guidelines are tailored to specific frameworks, which may suit some projects better than others. Instead, I propose developing a critical ontology of ancient DNA to dynamically examine its multifaceted realities, thereby reshaping our approach to research. To explore this, I will first deconstruct how ancient DNA has been perceived and limited by a Western science epistemological framework. Subsequently, I will review existing theoretical bodies of scholarship, including feminism, Black feminism, indigenous science, and queer theory. Acknowledging that my work comes from decades of labor and intellect of many, many brilliant scholars that are coming before me, I hope that it encourages us to draw inspiration and generate new ways of thinking. I advocate that engaging from these various theories of knowledge making creates space for the variety of individual histories, values, and perspectives that every ancient DNA project individually embodies. As such, this lens of theoretical multivocality allows us to grow beyond the limitations of a Western science epistemological framework to critically reconceptualize how we approach research. Now, when I originally conceptualized this talk last year, I thought that there was no way that I could fill 14 minutes with only theory. And wouldn't it also be great to also talk about my involvement with the first Baptist Church project in Williamsburg, Virginia? However, it turns out theory takes a lot of words. So therefore, if you want to learn more about this project, please check out our symposium at the SAAs next month. So approaching ancient DNA from an ontological perspective allows us as anthropologists to do our favorite thing, to step out of our own shoes, metaphorically speaking, of course, to try to understand the world from another perspective. If we take this reflexive approach, we can begin to comprehend how ancient DNA is embedded within a Western science epistemology. Indeed, when viewing ancient DNA through this framework, we can begin to see how it becomes essentialized in the public imagination. Beginning with the hallmark DNA mystique originally published in 1995, social scientists Nelkin and Lindy demonstrated that DNA was becoming a cultural icon and simultaneously becoming embodied imbued with all the promise and possibilities emblematic of the anticipation of the Human Genome Project in 2001. This, in combination with poor communication regarding the complex realities of genomic research, has led to a rhetoric of genetic essentialism, defined by Dar Nimrod as the idea that DNA can often be perceived as the ultimate arbitrator of truth. This, in turn, impacts how ancient DNA has and continues to be seen by the public today. Ancient DNA is increasingly a part of the public's understanding of science. In 2022, the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine went to Dr. Svante Pablo for his groundbreaking work on the Neanderthal genome that helped spur the growth of paleogenomics. A few months ago, I was surprised to see that ancient DNA was also featured in the New York Times' extremely popular news podcast, The Daily. And this is because ancient DNA has yielded some truly monumental findings that have challenged our understanding of our human origins in ways that we could have only dreamed about 20 years ago. However, as the oft-quoted uncle of the Marvel superhero Spider-Man would say, with great power comes great responsibility. With this great promise and prowess of ancient DNA, we witnessed an explosion of research emerging around 2014, with thousands of genomes being generated. However, this has come with its own host of issues. For example, it's important to understand that behind each of these genomes was once a living person. Within our Western science ethical framework, the processes that contribute to marginalization in life can be carried on into death. Under our current U.S. institutional review board system, skeletal individuals are defined as persons who are no longer living and therefore do not require permission or consent to carry out research upon. Therefore, within this system, descendants do not have rights to decide if and how genetic research can be carried out on their ancestors' remains. Second, the vast majority of this research was being completed by large laboratories in the United States and Europe, contributing to this process of scientific extraction in both a literal and figurative sense. This has been really clearly articulated by recent work from Yanez, Arguelles, as well as Preacher and Núñez de la Mora's articles, who have all theorized how ancient DNA exists within a core periphery model, dictating the questions, pace, resources, and values of the field. They argue that the geopolitical project of ancient DNA should be attuned to these issues of power imbalances, sovereignty, and sustainability in order to counter the ways that Western science as a colonialist agent continues to extract and divide. Today, this is spurred of what I think of as an ethical course correction, whereby we as a field are critically examining the ways that ancient DNA has fallen short amidst this paleogenomic revolution. In this critical re-examination, I think of ancient DNA as a mirror reflecting back the shortcomings of Western science. Things like essentialism, reliance on objectivity, as well as a narrow understanding of ethics materialized through the IRB, can act as a siphon for our ethical epistemology to function solely within a Western colonialist framework. This time of ethical course correction has led to a lot of great guidelines, which have helped us brainstorm different ways to make our work more ethically conscious. However, as stated in the beginning of this presentation, a downside of these guidelines is that they can be too context specific, meaning that it might work really well for one project, but not another, and it can often feel like a checklist to be added on as an addendum to an end of a project. Instead, I argue that we need to critically reimagine how we conceptualize our work independent of these Western colonialist frameworks. Instead, incorporating a wider ontological approach, which draws from feminist science, Black feminism, indigenous science, and queer theory, may instead be more useful in teaching people how to think about the broader ethical context their work exists within, rather than handing them solutions which may or may not apply. So we will first begin with feminist theory. Feminist theory thinks about the ways that gender informs knowledge production, and more specifically about how gender inequalities intersect with power hierarchies in the production of such knowledge. Scholars such as Donna Haraway have called attention to the significance of an individual's social point of location, or positionality within various dimensions of identity and power structures. The concept of intersectionality, as articulated by Black feminist scholars Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Collins, also draws upon this framework by demonstrating how the complexities of marginalization, particularly concerning race and gender, can often be intertwined. Understanding our own positionality can also help us think about how knowledge itself is situated within larger power structures, specifically affecting what knowledge systems are valued and how that knowledge is produced. Haraway has also argued for a successor science project, whereby we should strive to understand how our points of location influence our conceptions of objectivity, truth, and empiricism to move beyond the binary of limitations of a Western science framework. When applied to ancient DNA, we can imagine this as understanding that, one, the identities of both scientists and communities are co-informed by our gender, race, class, education, and other processes that create majoritization/minoritization. Two, that these identities give rise to lived experiences, or what Sandra Harding describes as epistemic privilege, which denotes that the critical perspectives obtained from experiencing life from marginalized positions. For persons coming from majoritized positions, for example, myself as a white person, this means that it is absolutely essential to actively listen and incorporate perspectives from scholars of color, queer folks, women, or communities outside of the academy in order to recenter or decolonize our thought. However, it's also critically important to amplify and not appropriate knowledge along in this process. This reorientation to ourselves and our field can also help us understand that the knowledge produced from ancient DNA does not need to only serve Western epistemological frameworks, but that it can be co-produced and incorporated into other forms of knowledge making. Thinkers in indigenous science frameworks such as Sonia Adelaide write specifically about braiding knowledge, whereby indigenous stories and belief systems can be woven together with archaeological evidence and Western science in ways that co-inform knowledge production. Similar to braiding knowledge is the concept of two-eyed seeing, introduced by McCormick elder Albert Marshall, and approaches the understanding of the word using, quote, one eye with the strengths of indigenous ways of knowing, and to see from the other eye with the strengths of Western ways of knowing, and to use both of these eyes together, unquote. The conversation between indigenous scientists and genetic research has been coexisting for the last 2 decades, with notable publications such as Native American DNA by Kim Talbert, and has moved into ancient DNA spaces through the work from Nada Garrison, Crystal Choatsi, and Christina Claw, and others. These authors have conceptualized ethical frameworks in ancient DNA from these perspectives, which, one, center the rights of descendant communities, and two, work to ensure that the processes of scientific research are fully communicated and accountable to the communities themselves. This work has been critical in helping center the conversation around ethics in ancient DNA by identifying issues impacting affected communities and providing guidance to help grow the field. Another theoretical framework which holds space for multiple ways of knowing is queer science and queer theory, which acknowledges the multiple ways that knowledge can be constructed and perceived. Within this construction of knowledge, queer science challenges us to think expansively and curiously about what is considered normative and scientific fact, including emotions and feelings, as empirical ways of reaching a richer level of understanding. In this questioning of normativity, queer science calls us to think outside of the box, to create space for these multiplicities of knowledge forms, positionalities of experiences, and ways of perceiving the world around us. As such, the application of queer theory to ancient DNA becomes an ideal way to challenge us as a discipline to rethink how we approach and conduct science. Building from this non-normative framework and expansiveness in queer theory, we can begin to think about ancient DNA as an embodied form of knowledge. Ancient DNA is unique in that it sits at the intersection of cutting-edge science that heavily relies on objectivity and empiricism, but also takes on symbolic forms through public perception to create meaning in other ways. It is a series of A's, G's, C's, and T's written into our histories and woven into our stories. It is a quantifiable fluorescence on a qubit spectrophotometer and the essence of our ancestors. It is a way of understanding genetic variation of populations that lived 5,000 years ago and nothing of value to others. Given all these forms that ancient DNA exists within, we need an embodied way of thinking that can critically reapproach how we structure our research. Our discipline has historically prioritized Western science epistemological frameworks. Instead, we need to give space and value to other forms of knowledge making. I want us to critically think about how we can apply some, all, or even other theoretical frameworks that were not mentioned in this talk to your own work, so a thought exercise in order to think more expansively about the ways that you can grow in your own ethical framework outside of these normative bounds. Thank you very much. And I just would like to thank all these folks in the audience who have helped me generate these conversations, helped me listen, told me what to read. And I encourage you guys all to have conversations too. So thank you very much.
So I would like to welcome our next presenter to the stage, Kayla Connors, presenting Birthing Across the Diaspora, Making Sense of Embodiment Through Black Pregnancy.
Hi, I'm Kayla Connor, and I'm presenting collaborative work between myself and Dr. Robin Nelson, faculty at Arizona State University. There we go. So low birth weight is when an infant is born under 5 pounds, 8 ounces, and it's associated with a higher risk of infant mortality and later life cardiovascular disease risk. Preterm births occur before 37 weeks of gestation, and they're associated with an increased risk of developing cardiometabolic, psychiatric, and respiratory morbidity. Alarmingly, rates of low birth weight and preterm birth have increased in the last decade, with preterm birth reaching an all-time high in 2021. Non-Hispanic Black infants are more likely to be born low birth weight and preterm, and the increase in these outcomes in the last decade has disproportionately burdened this racialized demographic. These outcomes are early but important factors in lifelong health trajectories, and their increase suggests an urgent need to understand contributing factors to identify more effective interventions. Broadly, the current study is looking to examine how college as a particular biosocial racialized experience is embodied and influences Black infant health outcomes. Specifically, this project is concerned with how attending a historically Black college or university, or HBCU, versus attending a predominantly white institution, or PWI, might offer differential stress and buffering exposures that later impact low birth weight and preterm birth rates in a nationally representative data set. In her 2022 book, Black Feminism and Women in Gender Studies scholar Treva B. Lindsay wrote, "This work requires a penetrative attention to silences and death-dealing logics that stretch back hundreds of years. This kind of historical approach offers the possibility for hearing more recent screams of those being killed softly and spectacularly. Soft killings refer to those that are slow and intentionally imperceptible. Spectacular killings are those fatal incidents when a life is snuffed out in an instant. Here, we suggest that looking at how experiences of systemic racism become embodied and impact infant health disparities on a population level removes the opacity of some of these soft and imperceptible killings. The classic social determinants of health model proposes that when provided access to adequate health care, improved health behavior, increased educational attainment, and financial resources, disparities in health outcomes across racialized groups would dissipate. However, data consistently suggests that this is not the case with Black low birth weight and preterm birth outcomes. The question then becomes, what else drives these observed health disparities? In 2005, social epidemiologist Nancy Krieger develops a working definition of embodiment that moves it towards a measurable assessment of the material relationship between our experiences across generations and individual health outcomes. Importantly, Krieger highlights how biology can't be understood outside of social, structural, and historical context. This theory of embodiment is useful for hypothesizing how and why Black women and infants face the highest burden of preterm birth and low birth weight across educational attainment levels, and it opens pathways for hypothesizing which experiences might be salient contributors to observed disparities. Weathering theory orients us to the possibility that exposure to chronic stress before pregnancy can, through biopsychosocial processes, increase the risk of adverse birth outcomes during pregnancy. Arlene Geronimus defined defined weathering as a phenomenon where the effects of social inequality on the health of populations may compound with age, leading to growing gaps in health status through adulthood that can affect fetal health. Geronimus proposes that racially salient social experiences, like attending an HBCU, can be important buffers against weathering effects. Additionally, skin deep resilience is a useful theoretical framing in orienting us towards the biological cost of upward mobility for Black people. Skin deep resilience is a theory that suggests that upward mobility is associated with a trade off whereby economic success and good mental health come at the expense of physical health. Much of this literature has focused on the impact of college experiences on the health and well being of Black and Brown folks. So, through what mechanisms would something like maternal experiences at an HBCU or PWI during college, which can occur well before birth, potentially impact infant outcomes like low birth weight and preterm birth? Life history theory and the developmental origins of health and disease hypothesis suggests that experiences during sensitive points in development, like late adolescence, can have an enduring effect well after exposure to those environmental stimuli. Sensitive periods are times of significant development where one's mind or body may be especially plastic and responsive to psychosocial or physical stressors. When this is combined with intergenerational theories, it has been argued that what a woman experiences well before pregnancy is important for the health of her infant. Accordingly, some have suggested that a life course approach is necessary for understanding disparities in Black maternal infant health. Late adolescence occurs during the late teens and early 20s, and it aligns closely with college attendance. It's a sensitive period in brain development, and socially it's important for the long-term establishment of social community and identity. A previous study showed that experiences of racism during adolescence were tied to an increased risk of preterm birth for Black women, suggesting that college may be an important time both biologically and socially to look at the impact of race-related stress on Black women's birth outcomes. College is also important to focus on because it's a key avenue for upward mobility for many Americans. The data on this slide are from a 2021 study on birth outcomes and socioeconomic status. These two graphs show the percentage of infants born low birth weight for women who have attained either high school or college degrees. The blue line is the percent of Black infants born low birth weight, while the red line is the percent of white infants born low birth weight across the decade. Between the high school and college degree groups, we see two key themes emerge. First, as would be hypothesized with traditional social determinants of health models, this research group found that Black and white infants have improved low birth weight risk with increased maternal educational attainment. Second, across both educational groups, Black infants still have the highest burden of low birth weight. In the case of preterm births, previous work found that the gap in preterm birth outcomes between high SES Black and white folks is actually wider than the gap in preterm birth outcomes between low SES Black and white folks. All of this suggests that educational attainment for Black women is not as protective as it should be, and so what experiences might contribute to this? Positive racialized experiences, including racially salient social support, can be protective against some of the effects of weathering in the context of low birth weight and preterm birth. HBCUs, universities whose principal mission is the education of Black Americans, are important sources of social capital and denser social networks for Black students during and after college. Additionally, students of color at PWIs have been shown to have higher physiological and psychosocial measures of stress, suggesting that PWIs might contribute to the weathering for Black students. Notably, in a previous study, HBCU attendance in undergrad was found to be protective against metabolic disease risk for alumni well into their 30s. This suggests that HBCU attendance could buffer against some of the weathering effects of college attendance, and its impact should be considered in the context of intergenerational outcomes. This leads us to the question of focus for our presentation. Does attending a historically Black college or university versus a predominantly white institution correlate with differences in Black women's first pregnancy, infant birth weight, and preterm birth? Our first hypothesis is that Black infants born to women who went to HBCUs will have heavier birth weights when compared to infants whose mothers attended PWIs for undergrad. Our second hypothesis is that Black infants who were born to women who went to HBCUs will have lower preterm birth rates when compared to infants whose mothers attended PWIs for undergrad. This study uses data from AdHealth Dataset, a nationally representative longitudinal study that began collecting data on youth in 1994, wave 1. And since the first wave of data collection, there have been 4 waves of follow-up, with the most recent wave being collected in 2018, wave 5. This analysis will use data from wave 1 and wave 5. So our demographic of focus is our singleton birth, firstborn infants of self-identifying non-Hispanic Black women who graduated from college and gave birth by wave 5 and gave birth after the age of 20. Our exposure variables are HBCU versus PWI attendance, and our outcomes are infant birth weight and preterm birth. We controlled for age of mother at infant birth, maternal census region of origin, maternal early life socioeconomic status, and maternal nativity. We ran linear regression models for both groups of college attendees, and we had birth weight and preterm birth as separate outcome variables. What did we find? We had a final sample size of 179 with 2 groups that were similar in terms of their age at first birth and childhood socioeconomic status measures. The national low birth weight and preterm rates for non-Hispanic Black women is around 14%, and our PWI group was slightly lower than that, while our HBCU group is actually slightly higher. Notably, our HBCU group had slightly lower birth weights and higher preterm birth incidence when compared to our PWI group, which is the opposite of what we hypothesized. So, after generating our descriptive stats and noticing these trends, we ran our statistical model. Ultimately, we found that while not significant, HBCU attendance is trending towards an association with lower birth weight. However, maternal nativity was one of the key things that stood out as being slightly positively correlated with birth weight. But in this model, the strongest predictor of birth weight in this cohort was preterm birth status. And previous work has proposed that low birth weight in Black American populations is driven by fetal growth restriction due to maternal stress. However, the strong association between preterm birth and low birth weight would suggest that that may not be what is driving low birth weight in this sample. Next, we looked at preterm birth. And with the strong relationship between preterm birth and low birth weight, we ran another model that had preterm birth as the primary outcome and had all of the same control variables. HBCU versus PWI attendance was not predictive of infant low birth weight in this cohort, but maternal age at first birth, maternal childhood socioeconomic status, and infant male sex were all positively correlated with preterm birth outcomes. These findings are consistent with the weathering hypothesis and previous literature looking at these factors in preterm birth, and they demonstrate that despite the small sample size, the data was able to detect common predictors for preterm birth and low birth weight outcomes. So, we hypothesized that HBCU attendance would be a buffer against the embodied stressors associated with college attendance that would have intergenerational effects. However, our results show that HBCU versus PWI had no significant impact on infant preterm birth, but in our birth weight model, it was trending towards a negative correlation between HBCU attendance and birth weight, which presents a bit of a paradox that we need to work through. It may be that our sample size, especially for the HBCU group, isn't able to capture differences between the 2 groups in these outcomes, which is one limitation of this study. And another possibility is that different selective forces come before college that impact which institution individuals attend, but that also impact their exposure to chronic race-related stressors. So, for example, someone who's experienced more lifelong stress, race-related stress, might elect to go to an HBCU, but then might also be more at risk for preterm birth adverse outcomes. Another possibility is that HBCUs and PWIs may be much more heterogeneous institutional categories that offer heterogeneous embodied experiences for Black students. Lastly, and critically, It may be that 4 years in college is important, but not quite enough to undo the embodied intergenerational effects of chronic exposure to systemic racism at various points in the life course. Overall, other work has shown that HBCU attendance can act as a buffer against health outcomes, and that Black students at PWI show higher measures of physiological stress. So Black majority institutions can still be important for Black health. However, further research would need to look at whether these experiences impact maternal infant health. So future work, again, might look at what stressors occur before college and determine who goes to what type of college. Also might ask questions looking at do different college experiences impact post-college factors like healthcare access and racial composition of social networks. And also qualitative data that centers Black women's voices in these questions is critically important. And lastly, one might consider the role of other Black groups and institutions such as Black Greek Life and BSA BSU involvement. Thank you.
We're very lucky that our first presenter is also our first discussant, so I'm happy to welcome Lorena Madrigal back to the stage.
Well, this is an honor, of course. I love how these papers looked at time, and we have time across many generations, thousands of years in the ancient DNA, and how we're looking at ancestors and descendants, and where the science fits in there. And then we're looking at moms and babies as well. And we're looking at the stress, and we're looking at so many places at embodiment and what it means. Where's the body? And in all of these cases, we're asking the question of the outsider, the scientist, and everybody here is asking us to think about how the other is being embodying all of these stresses, all of these, in my case, the fact that we're looking at a confluence of slavery and how actually still affecting those pregnancies. But I also appreciate so much how some of us are thinking about incorporating other forms of knowledge as well. So incorporating theoretical frameworks that are non-scientific for doing science is so important in the asking of the questions. What is important for the person, for the people? So what is important for the moms? What is important for the grandmothers? What is important for the aunties? What is important for the babies? What is important for the descendants? How is it that they have embodied all of those centuries or decades of being othered? And so that's where I see that embodiment. And the embodiment that we now understand is truly inherited. Would anybody like to ask questions of the authors? Yes, please. There's a microphone.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering in my seat here while I was listening to the last presentation. Very interesting. I kind of remember like the potato famine and about fetal restriction and things like that. And I was wondering if you guys were going to go backwards in like generations to look at stress-related inherited factors that might also impact low birth weight.
Hi, thank you. That's a very good question. So with this data set, there's a little bit of data on some of the parents of the mothers that are a part of the study, that are the mothers that we focused on. And so it's a possible avenue. It's not something that I've really thought a lot about right now, other than thinking through like some of the things that I've seen in the literature as being significant, like um, the mother's nativity status, which has been shown in the literature to be important. Um, but it is a good, I think, prompt to go back and look at some of that parent data and see what might be relevant and interesting in terms of given parent stress or racialized experiences that might also be having this like multi generational effect. So thank you for that question.
Yes, there's another question over there.
Yeah, thank you so much. Is it Kala? Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Kayla.
Kayla. Thank you, Kayla. Very important talk. It was really interesting. And I am very interested in fetal growth restriction. I have twins, and so preterm and fetal birth weight are things that I've thought a lot about. And I'm more on the more on the biological skeletal development side. So I was just wondering, in your data set, were you also able to look at biological health factors of the mothers in terms of like their health status and their body stature and size and things, and how that might correlate with some of these factors as well?
So thank you for that question. There is data on some of the health factors like in earlier waves of data, and because it's a bit tricky to merge all of the waves, I didn't take some of that earlier data. I did a brief look at some pregnancy outcomes like hypertension and diabetes during pregnancy, and found that there were kind of like differing patterns. Like some of those things were more strongly associated with PWI attendance, while some were more strongly associated with HBCU attendance. And so, while I didn't see anything before pregnancy, there are sort of different trends, and it's not necessarily like this linear pattern of how all of these outcomes are impacted by college experience. So,
Thank you. I think we need more. It's such a multivariate question, right? I think we need more data like this to think about other stressors and other things that might be playing a role. So thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any other questions? Thank you so very much.
My name is Isis, and on behalf of myself and my esteemed co-authors, Drs. Charles Masiba and Sabrina Schultz, I'm so happy to speak with you all today about lessons from Anthrocast and ethical futures in casting, curation, and repair. So from 1962 to 1976, the Wennergren Foundation operated the Anthrocast program, heralded as the signal contribution to science due in part to its novel casting technique, but also due to the creation of high-quality casts for both teaching and research. This casting technique, devised by David Gilbert, created duplicate originals, or patterns that were made of very high quality, from which molds could be taken to create infinite numbers of casts without significantly damaging the original specimen. Researchers commissioned by the Foundation traveled to institutions across the world to cast original specimens and fossils. And as a result, Anthrocast manufactured and sold over 900 fossil discoveries, primate specimens, and casts of contemporary human ancestors around the world. These casts have ended up in institutions, in more than 300 institutions across the world, and introduced generations of anthropologists to the Wenner-Gren Foundation and to the story of human evolution. When financial difficulties forced the foundation to close the program, the majority of inventory was donated to museums and universities, while the remainder of the patterns stayed with the foundation. Part of those patterns and some of those casts were used to establish the casting program at the University of Pennsylvania, run by Drs. Alan Mann and Janet Monge. In October of 2022, the Penn Museum requested the return of the loan of the Anthrocast collection. And coupled with the recent discovery of the exploitation of the skeletal remains of Patricia Africa for research and teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, this request encouraged the foundation to confront the larger ethical issues associated with the legacy of the Anthrocast collection and its future disposition. Ultimately, the legacy of Anthrocast raises the question, who gets to tell the story of human history? And also how and at what cost? While not a collecting institution in itself, through the Anthrocast program and its funding of anthropological research, the Wenner-Gren Foundation has played a pivotal role in our understanding and disciplinary culture of collecting and curation. In exploring avenues of repair, the foundation first had to confront the following. What are its obligations to the institutions and researchers where these specimens and individuals were recovered? What are the obligations to descendant community and local community? And lastly, what is their obligation to the larger anthropological discipline and the scientific community as we all begin to turn towards more equitable anthropologies? To begin answering some of those questions, the Foundation convened a seminar titled Grappling with the Legacies of Anthrocast, the Work of Bones in the Age of Mechanical Production this past September, gathering an international group of scholars across paleoanthropology, bioarchaeology, forensic anthropology, curation, and history, and all of this expertise to generate actionable recommendations for the foundation to pursue the reparative work ahead. In addition to changing the narrative or challenging that narrative of human history, the seminar also called attention to the value of replicas. The value of a cast or a replica is often inherently tied to its equivalence with human bone. The more it looks like bone, the better the cast. And this is often tied into the educational and research value of casts, especially as we're looking to move away from histories of unethical collection. And lastly, how is this value impacted by the context of the collection of the original specimen, as well as the creation of the cast itself? This presentation aims to use a couple cases from the Anthrocast collection and the findings of the seminar to address current challenges faced by collecting institutions across the country as we grapple with colonial legacies of harm embedded in our collecting and curation practices. Since we so thankfully have someone talking about primates a little later, I get to focus on the ethical implications regarding our contemporary human and fossil hominin ancestors. Early in the seminar, we had to make a distinction about the work needed to make things right with regards to contemporary human ancestors in contrast to fossil hominin ancestors. We identified contemporary human ancestors to be not just anatomically modern humans, but with a specific lens of marginalization, specifically within the context of the United States, with a history of exploitation and, by extension, replication of Black and brown bodies. Those individuals demand something special, something specific from us when we're thinking about them. In contrast, our fossil hominin ancestors are, as participant Dr. Lauren Schroeder offered, items of heritage. This redirects the foundation's obligations more broadly to the local communities and institutions where these fossils and specimens were discovered, and those same institutions and communities have been systemically excluded from access to their own heritage. However, across both of these cases, I want to emphasize we see the impact of colonial collecting and harm that is limiting our ability to actively engage in repair and move forward. Our first case study is the modern pygmy human indominant bone, or SCP-18, who I will be referring to thus forward as the Batwa ancestor. Both of the ancestors I'll discuss today illustrate the necessity of thinking beyond our current models of curation and repatriation. The Batwa ancestor represents the right innominate from a Batwa woman in the Galloway Osteological Collection in Kampala, Uganda. This collection contains the unclaimed and donated remains of nearly 600 native Ugandans, as well as individuals from neighboring nations, associated medical records, and demographic information. It's worth noting that this cast was extremely popular and was actually sold as part of a set to demonstrate the variation between pygmy, quote-unquote, individuals and normal, quote-unquote, individuals. The case of the Batwa ancestor forces us to confront the explicit nature of biocapitalism. While the Anthrocast program was not necessarily responsible for the unethical acquisition of these remains, they were complicit in the translation of human biologies into multiple forms of capital, or biocapitalism. Peters and Venkatasen identified 3 forms of capital in their definition: financial, intellectual, and social. And the examples here list those types of capitals through the lens of collecting institutions. Financial and capital includes not only the profits from the past sold, but also thinking of the profits from ticket sales when people can come to exhibits and visit institutions based on the prowess that they have in these collections. Intellectual capital includes the countless research and academic opportunities made possible by access to high-quality casts, as well as the ability to influence knowledge production and tell that story of human evolution and variation. And lastly, social capital. As I mentioned before, the Anthrocast program introduced Wennergren to generations of anthropologists, and collections remain an object of status for institutions that are able to leverage that social capital to be authoritative in spaces with regards to stewardship, curation, and care. So we put forward that financial compensation to the descendant community is only the tip of the iceberg. Efforts towards equity and repair demand not only financial restitution, but redistribution of that intellectual and social capital as well, such as targeted grants and funding from scholars from the descendant community, the provision of ethically created human and fossil casts for teaching and research, and not just a seat at the table, but leadership roles in capacity building, as well as reparative efforts at large. In order to redistribute social capital, we have to be willing to challenge the current balances of power and who is allowed to tell these stories. The Batwa ancestor also forced us to confront that sometimes our methods don't actually translate across borders. Who do we even contact? Who is the descendant community? Do we go directly to the Batwa community? Who is the Batwa community? Even that term is a bit outdated in describing the variation in populations of those regions. And as we were trying to get into the specifics of that, we realized that all of these questions assume not just cooperation, but alignment from our stakeholders in their goals and cultural constructions of ancestors. The vision for repair should be led by community involvement, make space for refusal, and the adoption of alternative curatorial practices, such as long-term stewardship in the long-term protected stewardship, in the event that repatriation is either impossible or undesired, as well as co-curation models that allow communities to play an active role in the care and disposition of their ancestors alongside the museum. The modern human innominate bone, or the unidentified ancestor, is a complete right innominate of a woman in the George S. Huntington collection at the Smithsonian. The Huntington collection holds over 3,000 individuals who were unclaimed at death and remanded to Columbia University. While many individuals had extensive documentation and medical records, this unidentified ancestor has none, and is even referred to by then curator T. Dale Stewart as uncatalogued. Unfortunately, this identified ancestor is not an outlier, as uncatalogued individuals exist across nearly all museum and university collections. The unidentified ancestor forces us to confront the impact and the limitations under this violent system of collecting. Community-led repatriation models depend on engaged, biological, or social descending communities of care to decide in the best interest of ancestral remains. But who are we accountable to when we don't know who the descending community is? Alberti defines individual collecting practices as those that atomize people into singular bones and divorce them from their communities and contexts of origin. Centuries of collecting and curating this way have created entire swaths of individuals that we will never be able to repatriate using current models. The absence of definitive biological or social descendant communities does not absolve us of our obligation to address unethical curation and stewardship. These individuals in these collections are more than ancestors. They are individuals who have right to autonomy and a model of curation that takes into account their history of non-consensual use. With this in mind, I and many colleagues are calling for a moratorium on research of unconsented remains, but also a preparation for maybe that moratorium is permanent. Maybe it's time to stop using unconsented remains, regardless of community input. But I'm still looking. Furthermore, our recommendations for correcting some of those dividual practices have to do with detailed inventory and accountability reports. It's not enough to say what's in your collection. How did it get there? Where is it from? If you don't know, that should also be in there. And how those remains came to be at your institution. Accountability needs to come alongside those inventory. And lastly, the dedicated organizational infrastructure, the work of the kind of inventorying and understanding of our collections we need to do is not something that can be piled on someone's existing responsibilities. So institutions, foundations, everyone needs to be willing to put in the time, the effort, the funding, the infrastructure to create positions so this work can be done correctly. The fossil hominin ancestors raise a different set of issues, forcing us to acknowledge the impact of colonial hierarchies that exclude indigenous peoples from their own heritage. The discovery of Paranthropus Zinboizai at Old Dubai Gorge placed Tanzania on the map of the paleoanthropological world. But Zinj was just the beginning. From that to the Laetoli footprints and so many more discoveries, this should have been the establishment of a strong paleoanthropological and museum enterprise in Tanzania. However, countless discoveries from Old Dubai were extracted via targeted legislation, permits, government mandates, and gentlemen's agreements that ultimately privileged the goal of hero scientists over indigenous peoples. Specifically, the success and establishment of the National Museum of Kenya relied on the systemic extraction of resources from neighboring Tanzania at the hand of British colonial rule and in partnership with the Leakey Paleoanthropological Enterprise, including over 100 patterns and casts of fossils that are still in the AnthroCast collection. The erasure of Tanzanian perspectives in paleoanthropology demonstrates that the study of fossil ancestors and human evolution can never be apolitical, and we need to address the ways that colonialism is impacting that practice and the stories we tell based on that practice. When it comes to solutions and repair, Dr. Frederick Manthe of the National Museum of Kenya offered the importance of making time for truth-telling. It has been centuries of amassing these collections, and so many people don't even understand the depth to which their ancestors have been exploited, and they deserve time to grieve, express anger, and understand the full gravity of the situation before we skip to solutions. As part of those solutions, we call for the immediate repatriation of natural history and resources that lie outside of Tanzania and every other nation that has served as an extractive space, and meetings with stakeholders that position us in leadership positions, and sustained capacity building networks of access to share resources that have been equitably created. So something that came up multiple times throughout the course of this seminar is thinking of the histories and futures made possible. I challenge you all to think of your histories and futures made possible on the backs of ancestors in our collections. I personally used the Heyman Todd collection for data in my master's thesis without understanding the provenance or the issues with that collection and the coercive nature in which people were forced to be remanded. In retrospect, I would not do it again. But now that I have that information, I can make a better choice. Now that we all have this information, we can all make better choices. And towards a more ethical future. So first of all, if Henrietta Lacks and the ordeal of the theft of her biological material for the basis of half our medical industry has shown us anything, it is that provenance matters. The context of creation should be used to inform whether or if we work with casts or replicas. As another seminar participant aptly put, why we collect is just as important as how we collect. Collections amassed for race science with the purpose of subjugating Black and Indigenous bodies are unethical, regardless of how they were collected. This also forces us to confront our own complicity. While a disciplinary practice may seem standard, that doesn't mean it isn't harmful, and we need to be able to confront the ways that we've contributed to harm despite our best intentions. Ethical casting demands ethical creation. We encourage everyone to include casts in these inventories everyone is doing of their osteology, as well as the provenance of those casts. Understanding where the cast comes from should be pivotal in making a decision of how that cast is used and what happens to it moving forward. And lastly, taking a note from Isabel Stanger's Manifesto for Slow Science, we call for a manifesto for slow repair. Now, I do not want this to be confused with dragging our feet or saying, oh no, we can't do anything, we have to take our time. This is about being intentional with our efforts and understanding that broad strokes approaches risk the danger of recapitulating the same erasures and disregard for the diverse cultural perspectives of the communities involved. So it's important for us to move away from reactive urgency. I think we can all be honest and say that some of the urgency we're seeing now is having to do more with publicity and the fact that we are now being held accountable publicly for these collections. They've always been unethical, and Black and Indigenous scholars have always been telling me they're unethical. So now is not the time to rush to find solutions that took hundreds of years to create problems. So focusing specifically on long-term community-specific collaboration. A special thanks to all seminar participants, especially Drs. Danilyn Rutherford and Chip Colwell, who convened the seminar, and my phenomenal co-authors. This QR code has all of our citations, and this research was lovingly funded by the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research. Thank you. I forgot my program, so I don't know the title of Jesse's presentation, but I'm so happy to present to you Dr. Jesse Goliath.
There it is. Oh, but I didn't have to go blind on that one. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the organizers for having me for this wonderful and thought-provoking symposium, looking at how we can do our research with this biocultural lens, and not only look at these bodies as research, as science, as data, but also the individuals, the people that make up those lived histories. So my talk, Beyond the Report, the disparities facing the missing, invisible, unmissed. So just a brief outline of what I'll be talking about today. So with the missing persons crisis, it's really due to this invisible data that we just have not really discovered, researched, or unearthed. And going on further, what this identification disparity means, really why we created the Mississippi Repository for Missing Identified Persons, and then ultimately our next steps based on the data that we present. So when you look at 2022 missing persons data, we saw that just under 600,000 people went missing across the United States, and that's definitely underreported. We clearly know that there are people who are not being reported missing to law enforcement because of those systemic issues that we as Black individuals and those who work with law enforcement see on a day-to-day basis with encounters and interactions with law enforcement in both good and bad ways. But as you can see with this data, this is National Crime Information Center. This is law enforcement entered data based on missing persons that have been reported across the nation. And even with that data set, we're still seeing a disproportionate number of Black and Indigenous people missing in relation to the populations they make up in the United States. We're also seeing there's a lot of not available data, unavailable data. That data does matter. When we're looking at Hispanic populations, there is no information. When we're looking at two or more race individuals or those who are multi-ethnic, multiracial, that data doesn't exist as well. And then when we're lumping up populations together, so when we consider Native Americans, Pacific Islanders as Asian, not only is that culturally insensitive, but also geographically and historically represented as well. But when we take this idea of invisible data, it's not only what's not being reported, but who is actually being excluded from the report. When we look at census data, when we look at health information, when we look at economic, social factors, income, there are those who clearly are not being discussed in the conversation. And those are most likely marginalized communities. And those marginalized communities are also the same people who are going missing, who have these social and economic disparities placed on them on a daily basis. Now, when we take that with missing persons alone, there are other factors influencing how people end up being gone missing or unmissed. Some of them are individuals who are victims of domestic violence, those who are going through substance abuse issues, human trafficking, domestic violence, substance abuse, neglect, and poverty. And those are all affecting not only individual characteristics, but also compounding factors. Those who are impoverished are also going through those same factors when we get substance abuse and domestic violence. And so when we take that, looking at identification of these individuals, we're seeing that not only are they marginalized in the data that are represented, but also marginalized in how resources are allocated to them for when they go missing. For example, there was a study done in late 2000 by Von der Wright looking at the state of New York with missing children. He found that those who were Black children were twice as likely to go missing and also less likely to be recovered once they were found, or less likely to be recovered after a longer period of duration. We're not only seeing this in New York, we're seeing this across the United States, that children of color are recovered less often and go missing longer periods of time. We also look at it in terms of our national media and coverage of these missing persons cases. We're seeing predominantly young white women who are reported more often, 10 times, 20 times as often as other individuals. And of course, there's the concept that we saw, especially with Gabby Petito's case, that as people were looking for her, they were finding Indigenous and Black women buried in these same camps, in these same sites, in these same areas. So there is missing and murdered Indigenous women that need to be advocated for as well. And really, this all has to do with, again, the structural violence. That there are factors at play that are deeply embedded in our society. Social, political, and economic inequities that are exacerbated. And that missing persons is just one avenue or one way we can examine that structural violence. And political theorist Achille Mbembe actually said that it's death, that there are actually state-sponsored killing of these marginalized individuals. That the state, due to these structural vulnerabilities, these structural factors, are actually leading those who are living a status of living dead. That because the government is not actually intervening or affecting policy or change, they're essentially leaving these people to die. And so why we want to do this in Mississippi is that Mississippi is clearly one of the poorest states in the United States, and it's probably one of the largest populations of African Americans we see in the United States in relation to its overall population size. But there are really 4 factors for the goal of why we created this repository. One was to increase public access to missing persons data. Not only does the NCIC have a system, but now people in Mississippi can look up this information free of charge through Mississippi State University. And so we have a program that we've actually set with Louisiana repository, the LSU system. It's called Claire's FileMaker Pro. What FileMaker Pro does is allows for not only server connecting between our repositories, between our 2 states, but also allows you to export data through Excel and other formats. So not only can we show this data through a virtual and visual sense, but we also can start examining this data in a more research-based approach in data science. We're also wanting to advocate for data transparency. So we have this clearinghouse database that's searchable. It's public data. And so if you're interested, go to missinginms.msstate.edu, and you can search through county, state, all these information, demographics about who's missing in the state of Mississippi. But ultimately, we know that there is not enough information shared about these people. So advocating is by sharing, and sharing is advocacy. We're talking about these people who are going missing. They have loved ones who are trying to get out to the media and social public about this. And so ultimately, we're using social media to engage with our communities, our state, and our stakeholders. And so we have social media pages where we share and post and repost about these missing people on a daily basis. We're also trying to partner with our neighboring states because Mississippi is not the only place that has this problem. Louisiana also has this problem, Alabama and other southeastern states. And so thank goodness for Dr. Teresa Wilson, who kind of helped me set up our Mississippi program. And now we can actually communicate with each other, share information. People just don't stay in one place. They do move and live and kind of as people migrate from place to place. So once they leave Louisiana, they actually have a connection to Mississippi and vice versa. We can actually communicate with each other. And then lastly, examining those other disparities, those other factors that are influencing this missing persons crisis. How can we actually see if there's health disparities and other factors that are influencing who's going missing through GIS and crime stat and other potential geospatial analysis. And so what, in terms of our data we have so far, so 2023, we had 460 reported missing persons in the state of Mississippi. Now, why do I have that asterisk? It's because every day we're finding more and more people who were reported missing that year. Why is that the case? Well, we have NamUs, which is the National Missing Persons Database. It's underreported, and a lot of people don't have access to reporting to NamUs. We have Facebook and other social media posts from law enforcement agencies. Now, I'm sure many young people in the room don't use Facebook. They probably use other social media, but law enforcement use that, so that's how we find out things through Facebook. We also have a lot of nonprofit agencies working with us. This is their passion. This is what they're doing. They're advocates. And so we reach out to those nonprofit groups to help us share cases and give us information about those who are missing in the state. And also family. We have a family that contacted us through our website and through other means to share their family's information. So what we're trying to do is build a community-engaged answer to a community-based problem. So we're looking at preliminary data here from our database. This is as of a couple weeks ago. We had 1,305 missing persons profiles. That's both current missing people and archived data. So when we're comparing the numbers for that, we have 571 people still missing in Mississippi. That's about 43% of our database. The other 43% is those who are found alive, but really the start statistics found deceased. That's 60% of those who are found deceased in Mississippi were BIPOC individuals. And taking that further, when you compare Black individuals and white individuals in Mississippi, Black females were twice as likely to be found deceased than their white counterparts, and Black males were 1.5 times likely to be found deceased compared to their white counterparts. So we're clearly seeing this, again, this necropolitics, this marginalized death through missing. And when you compare it to NamUs, the national system, they only have 188 cases. So we are clearly the database for this information at this point. But looking at the demographics in terms of racial demographics, we're seeing the overrepresentation of Black and indigenous populations. We're also seeing that Middle Eastern populations are also missing in our state, but they're not represented in the census data. We're also seeing that those who identify as two or more races are also missing in a disproportionate way. And when we're seeing with indigenous, yes, it's not equal or equivalent, but we're still 0.5%. It's a very small population. And so we know that with the Choctaw and other indigenous groups that make up Mississippi, that clearly is also underreported in these regions. So this map here is a map of Mississippi, and for those who are not familiar with the area, the region, the counties that kind of outline or border the Mississippi River are considered the poorest in the state. This map is showing the demographic race of most majority who go missing in that county. So the areas in blue are those who are Black majority go missing, white and green, purple for no majority, yellow is Latinx, and then the orange is Native American. So you can see that along the Mississippi River, you're seeing the disproportionate higher Black community individuals going missing. Now, taking that in terms of demographics of the individuals, we actually have an older population who go missing than the nationwide average. We're actually seeing more men, and the average age is about 36.5 in terms of the average age of the individual. Usually with nationwide, it's usually younger individuals in their late teens, early 20s. But what's really seeing that is even though we're in a rural state, our metropolitan cities still have the highest percentage of those who go missing in our state of Mississippi. And that non-binary individuals do go missing despite not existing according to Mississippi's records. And so what you're seeing here is those starred areas are those where metropolitan areas of northern DeSoto County, which is bordering Memphis, Tennessee. You've got Biloxi, Gulfport, which are considered tourist destinations and travel along the coast. You also have Hinds County, which is where Jackson, the capital city, is, and then Hattiesburg, the next largest city. Now, speaking of Hinds County, you may have seen in your national news Paupers Field that was discovered. Actually, the Paupers Field's been known by the state for quite some time. What's sad about the Paupers Field that there's missing people who were reported missing found in this Paupers Field. There's 3 men who were found missing. And when asked to the coroner to discuss this, they said, well, I don't know how to find people when talking about this to their family members. This is a coroner that's been active since 1999 in the position in Hinds County. I was in high school back then, and they're still doing their job. This is elected positions. People are clearly voting them in. And these are the individuals that really should be showcased, that these men had family members who reported them missing, and they were found in this pauper's field. We have Dexter Wade, who was 37 years old, reported missing in March 2023, and was buried July 23 in that pauper's field. Jonathan Hankins was 39, reported missing in June of 2022, and then was buried in the field in August 2022. And then Mario Moore was a 40-year-old who was actually found dead February 2023. His family was never actually contacted, so they knew he was missing, but didn't have an official report set out for him. No family was contacted until after he was buried in October of 2020. And this is not just the case. There's already been more individuals that have been uncovered. There's 4 more individuals who were actually reported missing by family in Mississippi who have been found in this pauper's field. I'm sure in the next couple weeks we'll find more individuals. So this is clearly a problem that's not only are they actually following the protocols of law enforcement and working with community law enforcement, they're still being buried in these pauper's fields. So the necropolitics has a real actual impact. These individuals go missing and end up dead and end up unnamed in these paupers' graves. So what are our next steps? We're trying to tease out some contributing factors beyond the overall neglect you see in Mississippi. What are, in terms of health resources available to people, clinics, medical providers, food insecurity, where are areas where where there are food deserts in Mississippi, and police resources, what are their budgets like? What are the actual number of missing persons investigators or personnel that make up who are doing this investigative work? You can see here in this chart here, Jackson, Mississippi's budget is much lower than other cities of comparable size in the Southeast United States. And with a very poor population, they really can't tax them as much. So you're seeing less and less money being allocated to resources for investigative work and for police investigation. More policing and protecting the capital, not actually policing and protecting. And so when we look at health disparities, you all know that Mississippi is the 50th outcomes. That's common knowledge. But when we're looking specifically at being the 50th state, what we're seeing is that Black and Indigenous people are twice as likely to die from treatable and easily preventable diseases, cardiovascular, overall heart and or lung issues, diabetes, cholesterol, other factors. We're seeing that those who are Black and Indigenous make up twice as likely to die from these as their white counterparts in Mississippi. Now looking at food deserts, where do you see the reddest areas on this map? Mississippi, in the Southeast United States. So where are these food deserts relying? They are in the same counties I'll be talking about that are making up that western region bordering Mississippi. So when we look at Mississippi, we have about 480,000 individuals who are considered food insecure, which is 16.3%, versus the United States as a whole, which is 12.3% food insecure. And those top 10 counties are these areas that you're going to see are the same areas where we have a higher proportion of Black individuals who are missing and are considered poor and more economically disadvantaged than other parts of the state. But really, this is not work I've done alone. I want to take time to thank those who've been doing this work. I have undergraduate students who are helping with data entry. We have community partners like Mississippi and the Missing Mississippi Missing and Unidentified Project. We have colleagues at Louisiana State, specifically Dr. Teresa Wilson, who's been really essential to helping us get this off the ground, having us be able to communicate between these two states and share these cases. But also individuals that are partnering with sovereign bodies and our other activist groups who are trying to advocate for these missing people. But please, if you're available, please follow us on social media, look at our website, and for students in the room, if you are interested in collecting data or using this data for your research, please reach out to us. We appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Up next, happy to present Alexandra Kralik and Exploring the Ethics of Great Ape Skeletal Remains Research, Historical Perspectives and Contemporary Solutions.
boy, am I so deeply honored to be presenting here with you all today in this really incredible symposium. I'm going to start with a story. It's kind of brutal, but it's one that I think that's worth telling because it really showcases the urgency of this work and why it matters. Alfred Russel Wallace traveled to what is now Indonesia and Malaysia to study, capture, and collect animal specimens. And here's one narrative he wrote in his book Malay Archipelago in 1869. I know he uses the Dayak word for orangutans mias. On the fourth day, however, we found a mias feeding on a very lofty durian tree and succeeded in killing it after 8 shots. Unfortunately, it remained in the tree, hanging by its hands, and we were obliged to leave it and return, as it was several miles off. As I felt pretty sure it would fall during the night, I returned to the place early the next morning and found it on the ground beneath the tree, as it was too far off to carry the animal. I set to work and skinned the body on the spot, leaving the head, hands, and feet attached, to be finished at home. The specimen is now in the British Museum. I found that very orangutan in London, held him in my hands, and it was a very powerful experience to connect the history of his traumatic death with his brains. All that is left of his story is this little tag: his species, sex, number, collector, and location. His story is pretty much missing from the museum. I was able to piece it back together because I looked at the tag, the catalog, the skin, the skull, walls, his writings, because I have 8 years of experience with this very specific group of male orangutans and flange males that he belongs to. My research has pieced back together his story using his bones, skins, walls, his writing, to discover what walls couldn't have gotten on flange males considered what we know today. But in doing so, I began to really wonder about what other stories are missing from the ape collections that we study that could be pieced back together, how colonial era legacies may be impacting our research to this very day. A very important discourse surrounds the ethics of human skeletal remains research and curation. And there is a clear interest in the ethics of living great apes, but what of the apes who died, whose remains are curated in collections and studied? What we aim to do here is provide the starting point for a conversation regarding the ethical and theoretical considerations in great ape skeletal remains research, and hopefully build a collaborative, ongoing conversation with many voices and perspectives. We're deeply aware of our positionality in the co-authors as early career researchers and white American academics, and know the implications of the limitations of our perspectives alone. So we really invite feedback and collaboration in this effort. I'll end the talk with a QR code for feedback. This talk is based on a recent published piece in Evolutionary Anthropology, and that's what I'm bringing to you today. I'm going to start this talk with some of the history of the remains. So ape remains were obtained under extractivist conditions that relate to colonial power and violence. So we define extractivism as a colonial practice and mode of accumulation and removal of natural resources from organized regions, which you've already heard about today. Collectors were ruthlessly brutal towards the animals that they killed, cataloged, housed, and displayed. And as Donna Haraway writes, these men really thought they were facing danger in quote-unquote untouched wilds. And many expressed patriarchal pride of hunting and killing. These are the same men who defend things like Man the Hunter, really felt they are being a man and they are hunting, and they're the ones who collected a lot of the apes that we study today. So to address this colonial legacy, we offer interventions that are very well established in social theory. This is where we're looking to this long literature. So we're looking to things like decolonial theory, feminist theory, and the concept of reflexivity. For decolonial theory, there's lots of definitions. We're mobilizing the definition of decolonizing as a systemic overhaul and dismantling of structures that preserve colonial power. That requires admission of past injustices and the telling of stories of injustice. We mobilize reflexivity as a definition of reflection on the intended and unintended ways in which research questions are influenced by and embedded in context, social assumptions, and practices. So we're really thinking deeply about how colonialism may be impacting our research and those questions that we ask. And to address this really brutal history that these animals experienced, we really draw on ethical frameworks. We think on animal ethics. Lloyd Ruin's concept of entangled empathy helps us through this work, giving recognition of relationships and responsibilities. And we're drawing from this amazing, vast literature on human remains ethics, and thinking through the concepts of narrative and identity to treat individuals with respect and dignity and honor their life, stories, and identities. And when I use identity in this talk, I'm not using things like identify as lesbian. I mean the identity of these unique individuals as composite living beings who are capable of feeling with sentience, cognition, and subjectivity, employing literatures in animal ethics and personhood. So these theoretical and ethical interventions have brought us to 4 specific recommendations. And I'll go through them one by one, but really what we're arguing is that these are just sensible derivations of arguments long applied to humans and living apes. We didn't come up with these, right? We're just thinking through how can this be applied in this novel context. So first is contextualizing the individual. So historically, a gorilla was just kind of an example of a whole gorilla taxonomic group. So taxonomic information was prioritized at the expense of broader context of each individual. So this historical focus on classification and systematics means that the labels often include little other than taxonomic group, ID number, maybe if we're lucky, age, sex, and captive wild status. But this reduces plausible, holistic, ecological, and developmental approaches available to researchers, and it flattens the experience of these individuals, their lived experience, and our ability to derive meaningful research from that experience. It reduces our collective powers of scientific investigation. So we're drawing on these ideas of individual narrative and identity, entangled empathy. I didn't define feminist theory, but I'm just thinking through what Raquel had defined for you earlier in the ways that we're thinking deeply about our science. And we come to this kind of recommendation to emphasize the need to reintroduce contextual information and names to labels when possible. So as you can see in our example here, the specimen ID on the top really only had gorilla, the ID number, and we were lucky it had adult, captive, and female. And we're proposing a much more detailed label, things like her age, more details about where she lived. I'll get to this nuancing of the captive wild in a later recommendation. And what data is available, lots of stuff we could put into these labels. And the reason for this is twofold. Scientifically speaking, reintegrating things like names. You see on the bottom, it says her name was Haloko. So reintegrating names could actually really help us to trace individuals' history across institutions. You know, maybe if she spent time in a zoo, we can use that name to find out the information at the zoo about her life. Piecing together information across different scientific studies and building a more complete understanding. And then ethically, I see this as something that really helps restore narrative, identity, dignity, and respect. So we've created an easy curatorial sheet. We're fascinated to know if this seems doable and usable to those of you who curate Great Ape Remains. We really want to get feedback on this, if this is scalable. I have copies I can share with you later. I've used an AI model to show what it would look like if multiple different people with different handwritings filled this out. This was sitting with the ape, and different people who came by and researched them filled in information as they found it. You can see this is stuff that mostly would have already been probably available, but then on the next slide I have things that maybe researchers hadn't all thought of, or you can share what data is available and things that maybe other people can dig into and more qualified to, like the contextual information of the cultural context of origin and the habitat. I'll get more into this later, but this is just an example of that orangutan that I started my story with, that Alfred Russel Wallace had studied. So this brings me to my next recommendation. Our second is to piece individuals back together. We take on the colonial era history that animals were treated as one member of that homogenous species, like I was talking about in the previous intervention, rather than unique individuals that lived unique lives. But this historical focus meant they were separated by artificial body segments, which Isis has already talked about, which led to curatorial practices where individuals are split up. And still today in museums, you might find a skull in a separate room from the postcrania, and the skin, I mean, I'm lucky if it's in the same part of the museum. So if we're thinking with individual narrative and identity, entangled empathy, we can come to this recommendation that we should reconsider this curatorial legacy of separating out bodily elements. We should think about the possibility of reintegrating all bodily elements of the individual into at least the same place. And you can see in this image on the right, I've taken on the top, me and my co-authors have taken the image that Shred Washburn put in the New Physical Anthropology in 1951, of arguing we should think of humans in this holistic way and rather than separate body elements, and say, well, what would that look like for a gorilla? And this is Haloko. What would it look like for her if we thought about her in more of this holistic way? And this work has 2 important implications scientifically. We think it would really expand knowledge in life history and growth and development, as well as taxa locality life history. And ethically, we think it's kind to keep the whole individual together. Okay, this brings me to recommendation number 3, challenging or questioning the captive wild dichotomy. So the naturalistic fallacy holds the assumption that individuals from the wild are from this pristine, untouched place by humans, whereas captive individuals have been kind of altered, tainted in some way. But the colonial idea of the wild doesn't actually reflect reality, and it's harmful to people too, evoking ideas of people as static and uncivilized. And this concept of wild versus captive flattens a very messy reality. Wallace himself captured a baby ape and kept him at the camp where he was collecting apes. So that ape in the collection says wild, but he was held captive for a while. And many animals were taken from the wild and then promptly died in zoos, barely spent any time in the zoo, but the label will still say captive. So you can see it's far more complicated. And even the idea of wild itself, I mean, a lot of these animals maybe lived around humans and interacted with them. It doesn't necessarily mean this idea that wild is supposed to evoke. So the wild and captive dichotomy doesn't serve us, and we could better nuance it. So we're thinking through contextual reflexivity and decolonial theory to provide the intervention that perhaps we could rethink the tendency to exclude captive and pathological individuals. And instead of wild, perhaps we could use qualifying terms like these anthrotype descriptions. So anthromes are terms that are more descriptive than wild, and they're situated on levels. So you can have urban, villages and mixed settlements, croplands, rangelands, and semi-natural. Just these more descriptive terms that can give more information than just wild. And this has two implications. Scientifically, this would allow for a full understanding of context of each ape, make it easier to take human impact into account when we're doing this work. This is an amazing area of ethnoprimatology that's happening with living wild primates. We could do that with with the specimens in the museum collections. And ethically, we could begin to really decolonize our concept of the wild inner scientific work. So I come back to Haloko. So she was taken from the wild in 1970, and she lived a long life in captivity that was really brutal. She had a really hard life. But what's really interesting is she has one of the deepest dental enamel defects that Kate McGrath has ever measured, and this defect, this dent in her tooth, corresponds to the time when she was taken from the wild and brought to captivity. If she hadn't looked into that history, she would never have known. And it's illuminated so much about what dental enamel defects mean and so much about this type of history to be able to take that full perspective. So I got to go to my fourth intervention here. The history of Western colonialism results in the legacy of Western museums as a site of research and colonized communities as a site of extraction. And so there's this unequal distribution of in-country natural resource collections that Isis was talking about earlier. So a lot of people who live in places with endemic apes find themselves flying to Europe and North America to conduct their research. And it's vital to address this history, decolonize museums, increase inclusivity, and provide and start to remove the structural bias that permeates academia. So thinking through contextual reflexivity and decolonial theory, we emphasize the need to prioritize the perspectives of those from countries of origin, conversations and actions related to ape remains, and increase accessibility of ape remains for research. So as researchers of this paper, don't seek to offer claims of authority in any way, but just really try to argue that these actions should be led by stakeholders in countries where apes are endemic. But we outline the conversations that are happening from these people in these places and talking about ideas such as digital repatriation, opening up collaborative conversations regarding physical repatriation, co-ownership of remains, local capacity building. There's so many conversations that are out there that we tried to highlight when we were writing this up. But ultimately, we see that this has so many important scientific and ethical implications. Scientifically, amplifying perspectives of people from the global south and leaders and researchers from places with endemic apes strengthens scientific discoveries, puts more perspectives into work, which always makes science better. And ethically, it's important to work towards mitigating the disproportionate legacy of white European culture. We've also envisioned a lot of possible next steps for great ape remains research, equity, and access that we could offer things like a Wikipedia-like website to house all contextual information to foster collaboration, sharing of resources and discoveries across anthropologists. Digital repatriation, physically bringing hard drives and scans to places and training local scholars. Submitting a collaborative, maybe a Wettergren Global Initiatives grant, something like that. Just apply for a grant to start funding these efforts. But we really want to know what you think. We want to know if these ideas seem doable to you. We really want this to be a collaborative conversation. So what I've done is created a little survey. If you're interested, you can scan the QR code. It's also in Andrea's QR code at the door. And to provide feedback on this work, do these interventions seem reasonable to you, possible? What problems are we missing? Are there solutions we haven't thought of? What do you see as next steps? Do you like these ideas for next steps? And you can also just say, like, I don't want to fill it out now, but I'll give you my contact information. You can fill it out anonymously if you want to give me feedback and you don't want to tell me who you are. You can come talk to me, anything. Okay, I have packets too with like the QR code and the curatorial sheet. I'm so serious. It's my sincere hope that this body of work brings attention to the often neglected ways that hegemonic knowledge and implicit bias can negatively impact scholarship on graded remains. Bringing attention to how legacies and biases impact the stories we tell about our closest living relatives is so important. It helps us honor the dignity of these non-human animals with respect, and it helps us let go of pathologizing the bodies of those who do not fit cleanly and clearly into our expectations, and instead seek evolutionary explanations that can capture the diversity of bodies we see, whether we're speaking about apes or ourselves. At least that's my vision. So we have so many people to thank, so many people give feedback on this work, collections managers, but ultimately I really want to just take a moment here to just have gratitude for the great apes whose biological remains are held in museums that we're grateful for having had the opportunity to learn from. Thank you so much.
Hello again. It is my express pleasure to introduce our second discussant, actually. Andrew's coming, don't worry. But first, our second discussant, Dr. Sheila Thria.
I want to thank the organizers, not just for inviting me, but for conceiving of this important topic and doing all the hard work to bring us together in the first place. So the title of the symposium is Beyond Bones, but I get to discuss 3 papers that were about bones, so that's a little easier for me. And so what do we need to think about beyond bones when bones are the subject of study or of the conversation? And the last 3 papers were unified in a number of ways, but one of the ways that they were unified was in identifying harm, and then in thinking about what constitutes the right response to harm. And they were also unified by addressing the needs of those who are not represented, whose voices are silent, whether it's castes and unidentified individuals that gave us the ability to make the cast, unidentified individuals, primates who don't have a voice, and I think it was Jesse who said, what stories are missing? And so as I was digesting all of these, I was so excited. I was so excited to get these 3 papers because for each of them, my thoughts turned actually to my kind of geeky love of legal anthropology. Just it's a thing. And the reason is because when I first learned about legal anthropology, I was really fascinated by multiple notions of what is a transgression, what is the appropriate response to a transgression, and how do ruptured communities repair. And so, legal anthropology gives us a lot of ways to conceive of that in the short term, such as, understanding the role that the Nuremberg trials played, and in the long term, such as understanding the importance that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission played. And so, one of the things that is shifting in the studies of the papers that we saw is if law functions to define proper behavior and define transgressions from that, these papers are all interrogating really what is proper behavior in the sense of, is it proper for us to be using casts and to disembody them from the bones? And the Goliath et al. Paper was really just, what is proper behavior in terms of the differential treatment of missing individuals based on socioeconomic and ethnic identity. And then I was so happy to get to discuss a paper on primates because I feel like, and I'm kind of giving away the farm now, but I feel like one of the important things that is the area where we find a solution is in understanding, is thinking relationally. And so when we think relationally, then the primates are part of our community, they're a part of our landscape. And so the responsibilities are on us to view them as equally important. And I think it's okay for me to say this in this room, so I'm going to, because when I talk about all three papers, I want to be really careful. So, you know, as a Hindu, all lives are equal, and so a bug and a human are of equal value. They're all part of the, you know, collective universe. And yet there's a very dark and dangerous trope in the papers that I'm talking about of equating an ape and a body of a person of color. And so I just want to name that. I recognize that right now before I continue talking and treating these in a collective way. I really am not, you know, I am very aware of the harm that could be done if I don't acknowledge that. So, you know, legal anthropology looks at ways to handle transgressions of these behaviors. And what we were talking about in these papers was who gets to define what the transgression is in the first place. And the answer involves questions of power, right? And that's what everyone has been talking about. But what was really interesting, for example, in Isis et al., Dwyer et al.'s paper, was that the questions of power are very deeply integrated with questions of culture and even economics. And so, you know, she talked about, their paper talked about biocapitalism. And the reality is that bodies that have financial valence in death are not the same as the ones that have valence in life. And so, you know, as Goliath et al.'s paper showed us, they don't have valence in life. They are the ones that we don't look for when they're missing. But then when there's a chance to buy a cast of them, then, you know, then the financial valence goes up. So we all recognize that there's a structural inequality that creates this devaluation, right? But what I've always grappled with, and Dwyer et al.'s paper brought this up, was where does the buck stop? So when, you know, when we became aware of the harm that curators could do, one of the things that was hard for me to really stomach was the reality that curators are often untenured and often of the lowest power even within an anthropology department. So we're putting a lot on their shoulders. And they are operating in a system where the collections are devalued by the people who have power. And so I know that we situate power on them, and I know that there is an opportunity for the right thing to be done. But I feel like, you know, where does the buck stop? Does it stop at the curator? Does it stop at the institution? Is the, you know, museum, the University of Pennsylvania responsible? Is the provost's office? Is the medical examiner's office? Is it the U.S. government, right? And so that's one thing that I don't have an answer to, but I think about all the time, especially when we talk about what are the repairs? How do we address the disruption and the rupture? And then what do you do when it was the state that was the one that did the rupture, which is really the basis of every single one of the harms that were discussed in these three papers? Yeah, I'm asking the question. I don't have the answers for discussion. The second thing that I loved about all three of these papers so much, was they all talked about obligations to the individual who was curated without their consent, the individual who's missing, the individual animal whose violent death is spoken about so carelessly, and with respect to the paleoanthropology that Dwyer et al. Talked about, that the Alberti quote that you talked about embodies paleoanthropology as well. A single individual is divorced from their community and their context, but they're sentient, they're part of a relational system, and they were violently decontextualized from that in all of the papers that we heard. And And the thing that struck me is that that is true for paleoanthropology as well. And, you know, we treat the past as this remote space. And so there's an innocence to the individuals that are derived from that deep past. I mean, there's an individual, I'm so sorry. There's a, you know, the further in the past we go, the less responsible we feel for it. But, you know, with Musiba's contribution, I'm assuming, we are still talking about individuals that were sentient beings. We are also, because the remote past isn't the same space, also talking about heritage. And so the last point I want to make is that, you know, I always teach my students for a long time, because I'm not from an Abrahamic religion, the story of how we, you know, the history of evolutionary theory has never really sat well with me. And so, you know, Darwin, we all talk about Darwin like he thought of, oh, he dared to say that humans were a part of nature, but like most societies already know that humans are a part of nature, right? And so that's where I get back to that relational piece, that we, you know, we as biological anthropologists claim to be in this space where, you know, Darwin saved us all from having to think we're above nature, but we all are still thinking in that space. And we have to move back to the understanding that we live in this interconnectedness. So I think the collaborative conversations are important. That was the last point that Kralik et al. Made. And I do think that that's important because the community is the home of the individual that was separated. And so that is going to be a place where restoration happens, where restitution happens, possibly even reconciliation, where the rupture is handled. And I want to just take this, it's very self-serving, but hopefully helpful opportunity, I'm done, I swear, to just, you know, just to remember to bring individuals from these non-Abrahamic communities into the conversation alongside indigenous populations, because I think it's obviously we're in North America, right? So indigenous and Black bodies are the most are the most important sort of foundation and start of the conversation. But as we're working with the South Asian collections as well, please understand the concept of ancestor is not, we don't have it, or I don't have it, right? Reincarnation includes really the same concept, a linear ancestor-descendant relationship. The body is a vehicle. Once the body leaves the soul, the vehicle is, it's not a harm to manage it, to handle it. And so as we're all thinking about relational sort of ways to address the harm, you know, just remember, and I feel like Isis, I don't know that you technically said it, but what I took from your paper was you kind of said something along the lines of we have to be aware of what we don't know. And so, you know, just be aware of what you don't know. Thank you. Do we go on to Andrew's talk? There's probably no time for questions. I'm so very sorry. I'm back.
Good afternoon, everyone, again. So again, my name is Andrea Cunningham, and I'm excited to present our paper on behalf of my co-author, Karlina Velikova, and I, Fraught Reconceptions, Diasporic Decedents, and Paths to Commemoration. So I'd like to open with an excerpt from a poem by artist Vanessa Kasul called The Slave, the Sea, the Static, the Silence. You are individual N52. How many faithless noises have you had to answer to? I do not know your name, what language belonged to your tongue. Your voice, I can only guess, only ape, only try to carve. From these endless unfurlings of silence, I can see the very bones of you, but I cannot hear your voice, as we desperately, arrogantly try and approximate you. The poem that I just read an excerpt from imagines a dialogue between Kasul and an enslaved person whose bones she holds in her hands. The individual N52 described here is the catalog number of the remains of an enslaved Afro-descendant woman who was buried at Newton Plantation in Barbados. I open with this poem because it captures these feelings of frustration or even helplessness that can emerge in attempts to speak for the dead. I also open with this poem because I've worked with the ancestors at Newton Plantation and with individual N52 in particular. In the discourses around human remains discourse that have ramped up in our discipline, my co-author and I have been pushed to critically reflect on how to adequately address the needs of the descendant communities and the ancestors that we serve. So this paper is motivated by a theoretical model that I developed called the Black Postmortem Subject, which is the focus of an article that will be published in Transforming Anthropology next month. The Black Postmortem Subject is a model that adapts two of Martinican philosopher Frantz Fanon's theories to the remains of Black deceased persons. Alienation refers to the way in which the colonized mind confronts and internalizes anti-Black standards, while spatial compartmentalization refers to the intentional construction of spaces that differ based on groups assigned value. These concepts both contribute to a process of rendering Black persons as objects. In applying this model to the dead, this model outlines a process for how objectification of Black decedents takes place. So this is the model of the Black postmortem subject. For the sake of time, my aim here is to emphasize exteriorization, synonymous with objectification. Exteriorization here refers to a state in which a Black decedent is conceived of and treated as a non-sacred object. So in this way, our perception of a set of remains and our actions towards them and how we treat them go hand in hand. In this objectification process, I argue that an underlying principle that gives rise to these processes is called intentional omission. Intentional omission is a means of strategically silencing the complexity and value attached to remains that we would typically assign to our own kin. And that effectively positions ancestors as non-sacred objects for obscurity or display. The model also emphasizes the importance of time in that initial conceptions of the dead at the time of death versus reconceptions that occur many years later reveal the tumultuous power dynamics that can alter outcomes of how we treat human remains. So in thinking through these concepts, this raises questions like whose remains matter and whose warrant objectification, whether through active misuse or discard. These aren't simple questions, as the same set of remains can be valued by one set of people and disvalued by another. But what becomes of prime importance here is who is empowered to carry out burial decisions. And in the case of historic Black decedents, their burial proceedings were often steered by people who conceived of their remains as not requiring sustained protection or burial with care. So in this way, burial decisions are functions of power, much in the way that Frantz Fanon frames the Black subject, in which a Black person is, quote, determined from without, and is treated as an object without depth that invites public scrutiny. So this is where one of Fanon's key ideas, spatial compartmentalization, comes into play. As Fanon writes, the colonist sector is built to last, all stone and steel, while the colonized sector is a world with no space, where people are piled on top of the other. Applied to exteriorized Black subjects, they are also spatially positioned in a manner that violates culturally defined respectful modes of burial. So in thinking through the notion of power mentioned on the previous slide, we see the construction of space as a mode of constraining the disvalued to specific spaces. This is reflected in sites like anonymous burial grounds and unconsented collections. Time is also important to this model, in that the obscurity of Black postmortem subjects can be further complicated when living persons encounter them many years later. For historic communities with limited social or financial resources, the prolonged protection of the burial spaces of their kin was by no means guaranteed. This brings to mind a quote by Christina Sharp, which states, quote, What does it mean to defend the dead? It is work, hard emotional, physical, and intellectual work that demands vigilant attendance to the needs of the dying. Without this sort of vigilance, there can be ambivalence around who is or should be responsible for these decedents, which is an aspect that can be exploited by people who rediscover these sites and tamper with and remove these remains. I and my co-author apply this model to two case studies from our work. The first being conflicting stakeholder dynamics at the enslavement era burial site at Rupert's Valley in St. Helena, and in reproductions of violence in the use of unclaimed, non-consensually dissected Black decedents in anatomical collections. So, case study 1. St. Helena is a UK overseas British territory with a population of roughly 4,400 people. Its modern inhabitants, also known as saints, are mostly descendants of African slaves, South Asian indentured laborers, and English settlers. As it's quite a racially mixed space, most saints don't necessarily identify as Black or even along racial lines. And this is relevant for the stakeholder issue that I'll now describe. The archaeological site that I study in St. Helena is a burial ground in Rupert's Valley. Despite the slave trade's abolition in 1807, it persisted illegally for several decades after. The British Navy seized these illegal slave ships and in some cases brought these formerly enslaved people to St. Helena as a transitional space. However, due to the inadequate housing and medical care on the island, thousands died prematurely before reaching their intended destinations. Rupert's Valley contains the burials of these formerly enslaved people, who are also referred to as liberated Africans. During the site's excavation in 2008, 325 skeletons and associated artifacts were disinterred. When the burial ground was discovered, saints, while seeing the site as sobering and as a space that shouldn't be needlessly disturbed, they didn't quite see it as a site of their ancestors. This meant that there was some level of ambivalence in the degree of urgency for reburial, and it also meant that there weren't strong policies in place to prevent bad actors from exploiting the site. This led to some scientific research on these decedents lacking transparency, and one project in particular significantly oversampling skeletal remains for genetic analysis and taking them off island to the US. Both saint and non-saint advocates pushed for the site to be commemorated properly, an effort that seemed to change how people related to the site over time. This all culminated in a reburial ceremony that took place in 2022, and in saints reclaiming decedents as their ancestors. We see in this case that there was exteriorization in the initial mode of burial for these ancestors. Most were buried in obscurity, far from the island's consecrated grounds, remaining there until their rediscovery in 2007. We see that the reconception of the site's ancestors over 100 years later still constituted further exteriorization, as the decedents were excavated and out of the ground for over a decade before the reburial took place. And on top of all of this, some scientists exploited these vulnerabilities to do disruptive research without accountability. But more optimistically, the site has shown a change in how saints define themselves, namely as symbolic descendants and caretakers of the site, which all signals renewed repair and protection. We see this in the images here, which show the community carrying out the reburial in 2022 and the youth aiding in constructing the coffins for the site. Case study 2. Anatomical collections occupy a unique significance in our discipline. They coincided with the development of the then nascent discipline of American biological anthropology and were, until recently, the most utilized collections in the discipline. It's fair to state that biological anthropology was literally built on the backbones of persons comprising these collections, as their bodies were used to create our forensic and biological identification. We can apply the Black postmortem subject model to the Hammond Todd Human Osteological Collection, comprised of individuals that died in Cleveland, Ohio. The Robert J. Terry Anatomical Skeletal Collection, which held individuals that died in St. Louis and the broader state of Missouri. and the William Montague Cobb collection, which contains individuals who died in Washington, D.C. All three are documented collections, so demographic information such as age, name, date of death and birth, and some clinical data are known for most of these persons. Historical research has revealed that most individuals in these institutions were poor and unclaimed persons that died in public taxpayer-funded institutions, such as public hospitals and state mental hospitals. Some of the Black ancestors in these collections did comprise local individuals, but most were Black Southern immigrants associated with the Great Migration. Some were lured by industry to serve as strikebreakers during the labor movements of the Progressive and New Eras. All were marginalized by white communities due to their color, class, and migration status. Black middle class communities also grew wary of the migrants when they continued to practice their Southern cultural traditions of gathering and worship. To compare demographics, here's the distribution of white decedents on the left for comparison. All three collections have larger percentages of Black decedents within them, which are larger than the contemporaneous Black populations of their associated cities. The objectification process of Black ancestors in anatomical collections began in life, as during the era in which these individuals lived, they were marginalized by society due to their race, class, and migration status. Objectification continued via the ways in which these ancestors were processed, which show that the objectification that began in life continues in death, which is a sentiment that we keep seeing throughout this symposium. If they were not claimed within hours as required by law, the state anatomical board was notified and would determine what medical school needed bodies or corpses for dissection. And from there, the bodies of ancestors were rendered anatomical objects owned by the state. This process continues as the medical school numbered and processed their bodies, therein reducing these decedents to specimens, bones, and materials without a lived experience or social identity. Reconceptions that recognize the ancestors' value in these anatomical collections are still very much in progress and require the vigilance earlier described by Christina Sharp in Defending the Dead. Reconception requires the discipline to not only acknowledge the biases toward Black bodies in these collections, but to also seek ways to engage with descendants of the ancestors in anatomical collections and repair the mistrust and harm perpetuated by our academic forefathers. If not, the vicious cycle of apathy will continue. So to conclude, while these case studies are quite different Black decedent contexts, they both highlight the complexity of navigating the concept of contested status for decedent's value. They also present a critical consideration of the role of human remains work as it relates to stewardship. And lastly, they emphasize the complicated ways that communities position themselves in relation to burial sites. The model of the Black postmortem subject, particularly the notion of intentional omission, prompts critical reflection on how we as practitioners relate to and see decedents as our own, and how we can recognize that these assignments of value are very much connected to action. Our hope is that this lens can contribute to broader discourse in our discipline about processes of displacement and repair that are essential to push our work forward. And I would like to thank the National Science Foundation, the Smithsonian, Indiana University, and USC Provost Office for supporting our work, and for all of our collaborators in and out of the US for making our work better. Thank you so much.
Okay, up next we have Catherine Smith presenting on digital facial imaging as restorative action.
Okay, thanks very much. I am co-presenting with my co-author, Pearl Mamatuba. Today is Human Rights Day in South Africa, which seems a pretty auspicious day to be making this presentation, to share this work with you. The depiction of modern past persons in heritage and museum contexts is a well-established practice in the United States, Europe, and the United Kingdom, but less so elsewhere, which is especially true for South Africa, where even fewer examples exist which explicitly address aspects of colonial history. So in this sort of four-part presentation, just to locate South Africa is down there in the red dot on the map, and that's a view of our campus at the University of Stellenbosch. We offer a self-reflective analysis of the creation, reception, and impact of two projects, two collaborative interdisciplinary processes directed at historical restitution. The Sutherland Restitution Initiative included facial reconstructions by myself as a member of FaceLab in the UK, and Fugitive commissioned for the Digital Humanities Project Biography of an Uncharted People presents composites by myself and Pearl from slavery archives, so textual sources, in the mode of what Saidiya Hartman might call critical fabulations. We operate from VisLab, which is a space I established in 2021. We're both artists and forensic artists working in academia from different backgrounds. I've come to this work from a long career engaging in different forms of research-led practice that uses exhibition making, writing, and education as primary expository tools, and forensic cultures and archives are my key coordinates. Pearl's path took her from an undergraduate degree in fine art into the South African Police Service as a facial identification analyst, and we joined forces in 2021 when I returned from the UK and Pearl decided to start her PhD journey. And I mention this personal and professional history because we're currently the only two academically trained civilian forensic facial imaging specialists on the continent. So it's somewhat of a lonely trade with a very limited community of practice, but I'm hearing a lot of resonant ideas here today, which is wonderful. Depiction of past persons. When considering this, whether early human ancestors or those from ancient or modern worlds, the objective of making these depictions seems clear. Those who commission them see a value in coming face to face with history through relatable faces that transcend time and geography. And the face is obviously a primary tool of interpersonal connection and personal identity, as well as a powerful and contested organ of biometric identifiers and social selection. There are a number of artists working, exceptional artists working in the paleo genre, but I did include this image on the left of a largely forgotten individual, Elizabeth Benson from South Africa, a woman who may have in fact undertaken the first plastic reconstruction attempt in the British Empire, that of the skull of the so-called Taung child, exhibited in 1924, the British Empire exhibition. Raymond Dart, holding the skull, is pictured engaging in both optic and haptic modes of knowledge production, whereas Benson is rendered a spectre in this historiography. And these are recurring themes in the way that we approach our work, considering material versus immaterial and actual versus virtual touch. There is a history of facial reconstruction practices and methods, which I won't go into in too much detail. In the center is the work of Oscar Nilsson, who's a preeminent producer of historical reconstructions. They're objects, but his skills keep aspects of the uncanny valley at bay. So emotional affect, pose, gaze, and context, anatomical and technical expertise, clothing and accoutrements. The reconstruction on the right is one of a man called George Lister from the 19th century, produced during my time in FaceLab. There's an interesting story about his hat, but we won't go into that now. The historical subjects who we see range from the anonymous to the aristocratic. And the anonymous, unnamed individuals, whether it's a Roman soldier or medieval girl, are archetypes, whereas they become archetypes, I would argue, whereas aristocrats or otherwise those with high status become somewhat historical celebrities. As tools for engaging with history, making it real, historical reconstructions do possess a certain affective power, and they can also be very useful for correcting received knowledge. I do have some discomfort with the production of these objects as mannequins, which we can discuss later perhaps, but I've reflected deeply on the fairly limited scholarship around the ethics of the construction, the production, and the display of past people in museums through this method. And there are a number of other sort of adjacent fields of scholarship which are useful, such as that on face casts and that which critically assesses legacies of race, science, and naming conventions. So of particular interest to us are the demands for historical restitution in post-apartheid South Africa, alongside the impact of involving source communities as participants in creating and circulating these forms of visual and public communication of science. So I think a lot about the object versus the spectre. And by the spectre, I mean the ways in which digital technologies create new opportunities and challenges for thinking about the materiality and affects of these reconstructions. So how does the method of presentation affect how we respond to these reconstructions? Do we relate to them differently if they're a 3D object, a screen-based animation, or a 2D or 2.5D as we produce representations, as a hyper-realistic sculpture or a digital render? Thinking also about the lack of representations of such depictions in the South African context, I've been wondering about why this might be, and thinking about questions of cultural sensitivity, so bones of the ancestors, anachronism, general wariness about working with the dead, critical differences in modes of history telling, so written or otherwise documented or oral, and repressed histories becoming sites of political contestation and authenticity. Who has the right to represent and speak for? But I'm also starting to think that there might be a wariness connected to the practices of making face casts, whether in life or post-mortem, and whether there's some kind of object similarity between these objects and facial reconstructions. So we started to think along the lines of visual strategies of remediation, by which I mean translation from one mode or medium to another, but also about the connotations of repair and care in respect of the idea, the concept of remediation. So this is the first example, the project of the Sutherland Restitution Initiative. The context is 9 unethically collected individuals, collected by UCT in the 1920s by a medical student from his family farm. Long process started in 2018. I was one member of an interdisciplinary team of scientists and researchers. It was a multifactorial and collaborative approach, following a participatory, family-led, and community-centered approach informed by archival records. It was a really unusual opportunity to produce reconstructions with familial consent and involvement, and obviously a lot of management of implicit bias from the outset in terms of how to depict these individuals. Multiple facial reconstructions, as you can see on this slide, show highly individual results if validated methods are followed, and the facial reconstructions synthesized complex analyses and did prompt very emotive responses. 3 unnamed individuals, unnamed in the archival records, were given names of cultural and spiritual significance by the SAN Leadership Council, and the whole process has been published in PLOS ONE as an open access article, which I encourage you to read because the project was, I think, precedent setting in many ways. What the digital also enables us to do quite efficiently is update the depictions if new information becomes available. So the addition of a disc worn in the hair and the forehead of Sarki over here. The reburial of these remains eventually happened in November 2023, which was very recent. And there's a planned exhibition which remains in question as discussions between UCT and family representatives continue. I'm going to hand over now to Pearl, who's going to speak about the Fugitive project.
The Fugitive project is a visual representation to publish descriptions of runaway slaves from the 19th century in the Cape Colony, advertised in the Government Gazette and this Deceit Afrikaans newspaper around the time of emancipation. The fugitive work was produced between October 2021 and February 2022 in collaboration with myself and Catherine Smith. It was first published at Charting the Uncharted, an exhibition curated by Clara Babette, commissioned as part of the biography of an uncharted people. Our response to the archival material used forensic facial composite techniques to interpret the physical descriptions of the runaways from the textual descriptions. It is important to understand that all forensic depictions are facial images produced without a direct visual referent. They don't need to be 100% accurate to do their work, and are obvious constructions yet also uncannily real. In referencing the language of formal portraiture, it offered us the potential to critically intervene in history's representational constructions, digitally remediating the original archival source via visual inventions and textual editing allowed us to assert details of personhood. The source material demanded critical remediation with concerns about perpetuating racially and socially biased language via straightforward production of source material. A detailed visual research was conducted researching social and material culture of the Cape Colony via local museum sources such as the Izuko Social History Museum in Cape Town, and researching ethnographic portrait photographs taken in the 19th century Cape Colony, of the head and shoulder photographs taken of noble chief leaders by Fitz Gustav, and constructing a reference database from online sources in addition to existing visual references, while also using the role of clothing as a counter forensic device in constructing personhood with reference to the late 18th and early 19th century fashion in particular. Statistically, our reflections and findings, we achieved statistical representation regarding basic biographical and demographics of age and gender of the 15 faces in the current presentation, which were parallel to Carl Bergman's research. The use of the forensic image skills in heritage context in South Africa, where it is seldomly seen, has proven to be very, very powerful in this project. The faces function in two ways: simultaneously specific and as visual placeholders of those that are not necessarily written in history. Visitors or viewers that have actually experienced the exhibition or the work have reported that the faces are intensely relatable and are familiar. For example, one mentioned that it looked like somebody that they would actually see on the street. The work has given history a face and presented the perceived history of enslavement in a more complex way.
Okay, just some reflections to finish off. Obviously, technologies like AI and forensic phenotyping are impacting this work in quite significant ways. I'm not sure if the animation will play. So when you take the depiction, one of the slaves that we produced, and use this very commercial tool to animate it, something else happens in how we respond to that facial depiction. We're interested in digital technologies as impermanent, immanent, spectral, and propositional. They're the opposite of a physical object. They're anti-monumental. They offer a different flavor of the uncanny. AI holds promise, but its current limitations are very real and often work against our objectives. One of the problems as well is that the current practice of DNA phenotyping, from which we can get facial information, relies heavily on biogeographical ancestry for making sense of its data, which some would argue is potentially rebiologizing race. So 3 ideas, just to finish. That second one is looking and touching, to point to this really influential paper, Joanna Safar, called Touching the Body, which thinks through processes of haptic and optic in osteoarchaeological knowledge making with reference to the performance artist Marina Abramovich, specifically a work called Cleaning the Mirror. The paper interrogates the tension between the dynamic shifts from object to subject and potentially back again that the work of osteoarchaeology and related practices is involved in. It is a process of sense-making through our bodily senses, perception by feeling, in which an intersubjectivity is often established, and is something, when we make this work, we feel this very intensely. So this paper was really influential in how I think about topical issues in forensic imaging and heritage practices, things like who is involved, whose voice is in whose hands, what is the objective, who is the audience. Are these methods and technologies really non-invasive as well as non-destructive? Considering available technologies used to create these images relative to their objectives, i.e. as either forensic data or heritage engagement, things of cognitive bias and reception and impact of said depictions. In terms of storage and displaying, I'm starting to think about repositories as hauntologies. And I just want to say something quickly about hauntology. The work of Esther Pirin and Maria del Pilar Blanco's work on theories of the spectral and spectrography, reflecting on Jacques Derrida and Avery Gordon's respective work. Pirin and del Pilar Blanco says the methodologies of history and geography are connected in how the scholar of a given time and place is indeed a recollector and reshaper of fictional or non-fictional stories about events that have slipped into the realms of memory and forgetting. We're involved in the creation of an ethics that can tell these stories of location as well as relations between subjects. For Derrida, the spectre is always simultaneously mnemonic, so he says revenant, invoking what was, and oracle, arrivant, announcing what will come. Avery Gordon says haunting, unlike trauma, is distinctive for producing a something to be done. So our approach in this work is about choosing to live with our ghosts and to find ways of bringing them into being as ways to have new conversations. So 3 points to conclude. These visual critical strategies of redaction and remediation have enabled us to restage forensic imaging to do different work. Forms of visual repatriation. Scientific analyses and methods, creative techniques and visual style can become metaphors of restorative action. And through these, they can offer, according to our stakeholders, provisional repair of colonial wounds through tentative restoration of individual personhood. Just to end off, this survey that is Pearl's current PhD study, and to thank everyone involved in bringing us here. It's an enormous privilege to share this work on this platform. Thank you for your attention.
Following that amazing presentation, Alexandra McDougall and myself will be presenting on the archaeology of Black mothering.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. We know it's the end of the day. A lot of us are jet lagged, so I deeply appreciate it. My name is Alexandra McDougall. I'm a biocultural anthropologist and a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University. And before we start, I want to say how deeply I appreciate the work of our facilitators and discussants, including my collaborator. Your presences in the Academy and your work in organizing the symposium give me a great hope for the future of our field.
To briefly introduce myself, my name is Delon Justinville, and I too am a biocultural anthropologist, currently a doctoral candidate at American University.
So in this paper, my collaborator and I will discuss the ways that both theoretical and social disregard for the labors, plural, of Black women has undergirded bioanthropological and even more broadly anthropological research, and will offer our hopes for a way forward. And I should note here that we're thinking of labor on multiple registers. So domestic labor, literal productive labor, intellectual labor, just to name a few. Our work explores both anthropological and interdisciplinary approaches. This approach is in line with the canonical precedent set by the New York African Burial Ground and its bioarchaeologists, as well as more recent calls by bioanthropologists such as Augustine Fuentes, among Robin Delson, Kate Clancy, and many, many others. We're calling for more integrated anthropological approaches and into biocultural perspectives. In today's talk, we will first map the ways. In today's talk, we will first map the ways the dispossession or disregard for the labor of Black women has been reified anthropologically and specifically in bioanthropological research. We will demonstrate by briefly offering two case studies, both based on osteological collections comprised of enslaved and free African descendant individuals from the North American Mid-Atlantic, for myself from Western Maryland and for my collaborator from Washington, D.C. And in closing, we map both past and future examples of ways to circumnavigate this epistemic violence in order to develop more nuanced understandings of what it means to be human. Our articulation of what we mean by disregard or epistemic illegibility of Black women in anthropological research is taken from historian Marissa Fuentes, who explains the way dispossession occurs on three distinct registers. We'll focus on two for the interest of time. In her work, she focuses largely on the textual archive, but I want to invite us to think about the ways that we can engage a textual understanding of bodies. At the heart of what we're doing as bioarchaeologists is a reading of the body to see what it can offer us. So her three registers: first, the body as archive, the degree to which the experience as Black women is rarely present in hegemonic interpretations of the archive. And in another talk for another time, one can talk about the ways a more capacious understanding of the archive can mean bioanthropologically. But for now, scholars such as Cynthia Hartman and Marissa Fuentes offer a much more comprehensive articulation than I can in this talk. So I'll demonstrate first what this looks like bioarchaeologically by walking us through on the ongoing work at the Catoctin Ironworks Furnace in Western Maryland. I am biased because the site is a critical component of my own research, but I want to say that I'm really excited about the future of what bioanthropological research can look like at Catoctin. So the Catoctin Furnace is located in Frederick, Maryland, which is the Western Maryland bordering the Mason-Dixon line, which is important for thinking about interactions with free and enslaved community. Until the mid-19th century, the furnace was operated by free and enslaved Black laborers. In 1979, a highway expansion project in Western Maryland revealed a burial ground containing the osteological remains of 32 burials of African descendant laborers. This moment was both the literal and figurative unearthing of the under-recognized role of African descendant people in shaping the 18th and 19th century iron industry in North America. Since 1979, 2 rounds of osteological analysis have been conducted, both by biological anthropologists in the Smithsonian Museum for Natural History, so first by Lawrence and Angel, and more recently by Kari Brohide and Doug Owsley. Their work, alongside the genetic work, has been covered extensively in recent articles by Science and Nature, where these images are pulled from. So we can first point to the ways that a traditional understanding of the labor of the iron industry focuses on the work of male blacksmiths, and in so disregards the domestic labor that Black women were forced to do, both for their white enslavers, but also in the context of their own homes. And to the second point, we can think about the ways these laborers were often under-recognized socially, and therefore unrepresented in state, national, and academic archives. We can also think about the ways that the materiality of the osteological remains of the enslaved body until the 1970s, the remains of women and children were often underutilized in bioarchaeological research. And what I want to point to briefly is what I hope are 2 concrete ways we can move beyond this epistemic violence to offer us some hope. The first being an explicit focus on the role of Black women and children in the 18th and 19th century iron industries, so more research, which includes, as I mentioned earlier, a more capacious understanding of labor than is traditionally used. And second is to turn to Black feminist theory and critical Black studies, fields which have long offered rich and rigorous theoretical tools for reframing our understanding of the social roles of Black women. In a moment, my collaborator and I will return to a broader discussion of ways forward, but first we'll turn to a second case study.
All right, so shifting locations a bit, a little further south from Catoctin Furnace, in February 2020, an M&I, or a minimum number of individuals, of 21 were recovered from a renovation project on the 3300 block of Q Street in Washington, D.C.'s Georgetown neighborhood. This is not the first instance, This is not the first instance of remains being recovered on this block. The assemblage that I am currently studying spans recoveries across 2005, 2012, and 2018, as well as 2020. In 2005, the remains recovered were those of a young Black woman no older than 20 years old. In 2012, of the 5 ancestors recovered, 3 were young Black women spanning the ages of 15 to 25. In 2018, the remains recovered belonged to a Black woman no older than 25. And so far in 2020, of the 2020 ancestors, there are at least 3 instances of burials with multiple individuals in them, likely mother and child. Newspaper records, as well as data retrieved by DC's Historic Preservation Office, revealed that these recoveries extend much further in the 21st century. Even in 1957, in 1957, on the 3300 block of Q Street, when a family had moved into one of the homes, they were renovating the front of their yard, uncovered a set of cranial fragments from which the Smithsonian curator at the time identified as the remains of a young Black woman. However, as we have previously heard, these Black bodies created these collections and the biological determinants that came from them. However, what does it mean that the Smithsonian curator did not find the remains of this Black woman worth collecting? What does it mean that even in the instance of biopolitical hierarchies established by these collections, the body of a Black woman still is not valued appropriately? On the screen, we see maps spanning from 1755 to present day, on which the only traces that we can find the only trace of identities that we can bring to this space are the cursive markings on map H that mark the Church of England, tying it to the religious sect. Now, when we take both Catoctin and Q Street and frame them, we can think through the comparative aspects of the plight of Black burial grounds, in which out of the 326 Black burial grounds that exist between Catoctin Furnace and Georgetown, only 26 of the Black burial grounds attached to African American churches remain. However, what this geographic data doesn't state is that many of these Black burial grounds, the recovery efforts were led by Black women, both from those that were found as freedmen towns to those even in modern day, such as the activist efforts by my collaborator Lisa Fager, who is the executive director of the Black Georgetown Foundation and who has been trying to protect and reinter these ancestors for years.
So we want to offer broader ways forward to think about ways that we can circumnavigate the epistemic violence that I think we've covered quite thoroughly. And one of the most prescriptive and I argue impactful ways forward can be found in the New York African Burial Grounds articulation of what an ethical epistemology can be. I list this outline very briefly, but it comes from the Michael Blakey article on the ethical epistemologies for biocultural research. The first being critical theory in the vindicationist vein, so examining the ways that we as scholars can impact activist-oriented outcomes and support them. The second being community engagement, not in the sense of simply sharing our ideas, but thinking about the ways that the community can form our research questions and at every stage of the process. Third, engaging multiple data sets, which is a critical component of my collaborative research, so pulling from archival collections, oral and ethnographic data, as well as bioarchaeological data. And finally, by applying African diasporic frames of reference, and so thinking about what an idea of kinship and relationality and space can look beyond a sort of white Christian heteronormative narrative.
And to establish a forward-thinking approach, I wanted to actually return to a work that I find very central to formulating what Black burial ground research can look like beyond destructive techniques. In 1997, Dr. Leslie Rankin Hill published a monograph based on her 1990 dissertation, Afro-American Biohistory. In this project, she elicits the sorts of patterns that we can tell from a number of Black burial ground projects that were going on during the 1980s, including Cedar Grove, including the first African Baptist Church in Philadelphia, as well as the New York African Burial Ground. Here, she situates a biocultural approach that identifies these different frameworks of mortality, of political, economic analysis, and the different classed, gendered, and racialized denigrations that fell upon these Black bodies. From these comparisons, she specifically identified in 1990 that's something that future bioanthropologists should pay attention to, are the ways that Black recoveries of remains particularly offer insights into Black maternal mortalities, whether it's biological, as Alex mentioned, the different impact of labor on the physical form, intellectual, or social. Moreover, she also, through this, she brings together statistical records, she brings together the archival record of these individuals, of the churches, of the cemeteries, and she reframes them as vital data, where we reshape this approach to death as an attempt to recover stories of Black life. There we go. And what she identifies as a biocultural approach, I'm extending through what Elizabeth F.S. Roberts terms bioethnography, which can be understood as a methodologizing of biocultural approaches and other bioqualitative methods. Lastly, something that I personally benefited from in my research at AU are what I wanted to term a Black feminist approach to bioethnography, which is not only a combination of the biological and the cultural, but what does it mean to think from the perspectives of those most harmed by this research? So, on the left, we see an image of our advisor, Rachel Watkins, participating in the original micro-excavations of the African burial ground in the Howard University lab with Michael Blakey. And on the right, Dr. Michael Blakey, excuse me. And on the right, you see Alex, myself, Dr. Watkins, as well as other collaborators and colleagues at the Arch Gala in spring 2020, where we not just broke bread, got to meet and speak with the many Black women leaders of these church communities, but we danced with them. We got to move our bodies and use our bodies in ways that directly counteract this sort of necropolitical, death-ridden approach to how we think of not just Black women's labors, but the recovery of Black burial grounds. And this is the sort of context that really can't be captured by a publication, but really indicates the sort of work and the sort of praxis that exceeds the lab that contributes to this Black feminist bioethnography that I'm attempting to articulate. And what better note to end on than to introduce our final discussant for the evening, Dr. Rachel Watkins herself.
Okay, I know I have like 2 seconds. So, yeah, thank you so much for all of you that hung with us till the almost end. And most importantly, thank you to the organizers of this panel. So important in terms of continuing to move our field forward. I don't believe that won't with me. I'm just so amazed by how every time I hear you all talk, you are moving the field forward, whatever. Okay. So thank you. Seriously, there are ways in which we have the pleasure, all of us discussants have the pleasure of experiencing time with most of you. And so we know that there are things that you are doing above and beyond the incredible work that you have presented here. There are so many of you who have been a part of this panel. So I'm finally happy to meet really in person live for the first time, just you in particular. I'm going to bring it full circle and start the way that Angie did with a quote. When it comes to changing the configurations of race, science, and racism, a robust agenda of intellectual activism that is advanced by scientific insiders who critique science's epistemological underpinnings may go far. And that's the Christopher Collins in its 2015 publication. I think that all the papers in this session have demonstrated what it is that scientific insiders can do when they turn inward, and that we don't leave the matter of critical eyes and self-reflexivity, or reflexivity and critical examination to, let's say, science studies or STS scholars. It's something that is very necessary for us to do, and there are particular knowings that we bring to the process that really necessitate us doing this work alongside the work that is considered to be more scientific. All of the papers in this session, and in particular the last three, emphasize that making sense, right, of what it means, what the phrase science as a social practice means, it's so very much a part of what we must do, right? And there's a really important part of that is drawing upon tools and ways of knowing and forms of knowledge that are well beyond that which science itself produces. These are the tools that are helping us to take science, the culturalness rather, of science, seriously. The papers are drawing our attention to how the culturalness of science shows up in ways that culturalness shows up in other terrains, ordering knowledge and humanity according to norms that reinforce existing hierarchies along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, and other formations, also showing up in the form of overdetermined and overrepresented environments, people, and various scenarios. I think in all the papers spoke to the ways in which overdetermined environments, such as the wild captive dichotomy, show up. Also, I want to highlight that Sheila, you are the person who taught me that the term anatomically modern human represents an overdetermination of a particular type of humanity. The papers also directly name and propose ways to address the crisis of overdetermination and overrepresentation of social actors and scenarios that are integral to the process of scientific inquiry. And this includes Kayla's wonderful paper about this kind of criticizing or taking a critical eye towards this overdetermined assumption that an HBCU experience is going to lead to a particular health outcome. We also have papers that are kind of turning an eye, a critical eye toward socially overdetermined and overrepresented researchers, research subjects, descendants, these overdetermined social scenarios, as well as the multiple ways that researchers are connecting with the ancestral remains they study, the different relationships that are actually at work in doing that research that often are not, it's not possible to render them visible in a kind of traditional Western scientific context. I also want to highlight the overdetermination and overrepresentation that these papers take on in terms of highlighting and emphasizing how the most necessary aspects of humanistic approaches to science are missing and need to be very integral to what we're doing as opposed to an addendum, right? So, I mean, I think that there's a way that you all are kind of working at a baseline where, for instance, ethics is an integral part of scientific research. It's not an addendum to it. And that's something that many of us had to get to later. One of the things that I want to applaud, and I want to highlight, and I want to applaud all of you for doing is kind of, in some ways implicitly, in some ways exclusively, speaking to the importance of creating spaces where overdetermination and over representation can be taken on, and how those spaces need to be spaces of non-knowing and unknowing, and that we need these spaces of non-knowing and unknowing to accommodate slow work, right? The work, the type of work that lends to collaboration with people who are in our communities, descending communities. I would say, again, highlighting Stenger's, which was in the Dwyer et al. Piece, creating space to bring in scientific connoisseurs. That's a really important concept in Stenger's work, I think. Also, the ways in which these papers take on the crisis of overdetermination and overrepresentation speak to the importance of relinquishing claims of authority. Pearl, I was very struck by, among other folks, but something you said during your remarks about the facial imaging, you said they don't need to be 100% accurate to do their work. That is what can happen, and that's what we can come to realize when we are not afraid to operate in the spaces of non-knowing as scientists and as researchers. Also, speaking of spaces of non-knowing, papers presented earlier in the session spoke to the realities of invisible data. So there are these ways in which we claim authority when using scientific tools that don't necessarily reflect what we actually know. There's invisible data. There's data that we're not looking for, right? And the reason why we're not looking for it and the reason why it's invisible has everything to do with how humanity is racially ordered. And I mean that, of course, in the most intersectional of terms. I'm speaking directly to Carlina and Andrew's paper, Cunningham and Villanova, talking about this paper highlighted in a really beautiful way the ways in which we work with these overdetermined notions of decedents and descendants. And I am so excited that your paper, Angie, is going to be published soon because we need it. I'm very excited about how your concept of the Black personal and subject is going to create a baseline for understanding the ways in which this invisibility or this invisibility, the ways in which we make Black bodies invisible and how it's something that transcends space and time in a very cyclical way. And there's a way that you are uniquely working with diaspora in ways that don't necessarily show up in anatomical studies of anatomical collections, was also really exciting. Just the way that you all talk about descendancy being something that is, it's a process, right? I think one of the other benefits of us kind of not being afraid to operate in spaces of knowing has to do with recognizing that, part of the reason why we're having such trouble identifying descendant communities and kind of getting on board with the idea of it is because we're presuming that we can know descendants in a way that's really not possible. So instead of asking, for instance, well, who's the descendant community, we need to be asking what? We need to be asking how are descendant communities constructed? And again, you can't ask those questions. Those questions don't even come to mind if you are operating within these very, westernized, overdetermined, overrepresented ways of knowing. Smith and Mama Tuba, wow. It's really interesting because we were talking about the importance that forensic facial imaging has, the effective power of it in South Africa, because here on this side of the world, we're in a period where we're trying to kind of shut down the display of ancestral remains. So it's really important for us to be hearing from you, again, to operate outside, to think outside of these overdetermined ways about what showing something is going to do and the power and the necessity of it. One of the things that I wanted to say that your work in particular brought to mind was how, in us to figure this stuff out, you kind of put out there that we might also need to be thinking about the overdetermination and overrepresentation of the written word and the printed word in this work. And that's something that McDougall and Jacksonville also highlight in their paper. The ways in which McDougall and Jacksonville kind of bring us into history. They bring history into this process in ways that are rendering Black women's work in biological anthropology visible is extremely important. And this is something Delon, you hit on Leslie Rankin Hill's work on your own in this really kind of incredible way. And when you started to talk about her work, I really almost cried because I remember, and some of you probably do as well, that when her book came out, it was eviscerated. It was eviscerated. And it kind of brings to mind the ways in which, for instance, the New York African Burial Ground was kind of thought of in the same way. It takes time for for us to get to these places where we realize what we know and what we don't know, right? And so what I would say at to bring it home, because yes, it's 8:33, is that it's always important, or 6:30 or 5:33 on Eastern Standard Time. Yes, it's always important if we're talking about Black feminism, Black feminist scholars, that we end with Zora, right? So there's a particular way that she talks about spaces of knowing, and she calls it the rim bone of nothing. And so, based on her appropriation of biblical scripture and allusions to the realm of the unknown, womanist ethicists interpret the rim bone of nothing as a space where scholars can merge all the ways that we know, and see, and feel, and do with our rational, critical, analytical, precise scholarship and teaching. And these are the spaces that make it possible to merge intellectual and moral concerns as part of rigorous study. And again, I want to thank all of the presenters for showing us how that is done. So this work requires that we study and act on moral conditions tied to the development of these practices that we're trying to undo. It takes intellectual imbalance, insecurity, and vulnerability, all necessary parts of this work. So Zora has provided this place for us, so we need to follow her good guidance and keep meeting at the